My own flesh and blood stood in my driveway and told me I was too embarrassing to be seen at his wedding. He looked at my rough, calloused hands and said my presence would ruin the flawless, wealthy image he had sold to his beautiful bride's family. He actually told them I was locked away in an assisted living facility, losing my mind to dementia. He thought I would just lower my head, swallow my pride, and let him erase me from his life. He thought he had won. But what my arrogant son did not realize as he sped away in his expensive car was that I had just checked the rest of my mail, and the bank notice I was holding was about to blow his entire fake life to pieces. Before we go any further, thank you for being here. Take a second to tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. It really helps this channel grow. I am Ray Gallagher. I am 68 years old. For over 4 decades, I worked as a heavy machinery mechanic. I spent my life buried under massive diesel engines, breathing in thick exhaust fumes and tearing up my back so my only son, Julian, could have a much better life than I ever did. My hands are permanently stained with engine grease that no amount of scrubbing can ever wash away. My left knee clicks and grinds every time the weather turns cold because it got crushed by a faulty hydraulic lift 20 years ago. I wear these physical scars like badges of honor because the money from those brutal double shifts paid for Julian's elite, out-of-state business school. They paid for the custom-tailored suits he wears now as a 32-year-old corporate consultant. When my beautiful wife Sarah passed away 15 years ago from leukemia, I promised her on her deathbed that I would give our boy the world. And I did. I gave him every ounce of my energy, my love, and my life savings. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the mailman handed me an envelope that felt entirely different from my usual pile of utility bills. I wiped my dirty hands on an old shop rag before I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a wedding invitation. It was stunning. Thick cream-colored cardstock pressed with shiny gold foil lettering. It probably cost $500 just for the paper alone. At the very top, in elegant looping letters, were the names Julian and Chloe. A sudden surge of pure, overwhelming joy hit my chest. My boy was getting married. For a brief, wonderful second, I thought it was a surprise. I thought he was finally bringing his shiny new life back home to share with the old man who built the very foundation for it. But that fatherly joy did not last long. Less than 10 minutes later, the aggressive roar of a high-performance engine shattered the peaceful quiet of my street. A leased silver Porsche tore into my modest, cracked concrete driveway, kicking up dust and gravel. The heavy car door swung open and Julian stepped out. He did not look like the sweet boy I raised. He looked like a complete stranger playing dress-up in a billionaire lifestyle. His hair was perfectly styled. His designer watch caught the bright afternoon sun, reflecting a sharp glare that made me squint. He did not come up the wooden porch steps to hug me. He did not offer a warm smile. He marched straight up to where I was standing and snatched the golden invitation right out of my trembling hands. His voice was cold, sharp, and dripping with annoyance. He said it was a huge mistake. The wedding planner had used an old mailing list, and I was never supposed to see this invitation. I stood there completely confused, feeling the dull ache in my bad knee flare up as I tried to process what he was saying. I asked him what he meant. I asked him why his own father was not supposed to know about the most important day of his entire life. Julian let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, looking at me like I was a burden he was absolutely tired of carrying. He looked up and down at my worn-out flannel shirt and my scuffed steel toe boots. Then he delivered the agonizing blow that nearly stopped my old heart from beating. He said, "Dad, you cannot come. Chloe's family is upper crust. Her parents are real estate royalty down in Atlanta. They are a prominent, wealthy black family with a flawless reputation and absolutely zero tolerance for mediocrity. My presence there needs to be absolutely perfect. You showing up in a cheap discount rack suit, talking loud about diesel engines and union strikes, it is going to thoroughly humiliate me. I cannot have you dragging me down." I felt the warm blood drain completely from my face. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. My throat was tight with a pain so deep and agonizing it felt entirely physical. This was the boy I stayed up with all night when he had a terrible fever. This was the boy I gave my entire retirement fund to 3 years ago, just so he could start his fancy consulting firm. I swallowed hard and asked him what he had told them about me. If he was keeping me a dark secret, how did he possibly explain my absence to his future wife? Julian did not even blink or show a single ounce of remorse when he answered. He told me he said I was locked away in an assisted living facility. He told his beautiful bride and her elite family that I had severe, untreatable dementia, that my mind was completely gone, and that I did not even know my own name anymore. He killed me off while I was still standing right in front of him, breathing. He told me to just stay home. He told me to keep my mouth shut and stay out of his way. He said that maybe after the wedding was over, he would text me some pictures if I promised not to post them anywhere online. Then he turned his back on me, got into his flashy sports car, and reversed aggressively out of my driveway without looking back a single time. I stood completely alone on the porch. The sharp smell of burning rubber from his tires hung heavily in the air. The silence of the empty yard was absolutely deafening. Every sacrifice I had ever made, every aching joint in my aging body, every lonely night I worked a freezing shift after my wife died, it all felt entirely worthless. My soul was shattered into a million pieces. I wanted to collapse into Sarah's old armchair in the living room and cry until my tired lungs gave out. But I am not a weak man. I am a mechanic. When a massive machine is broken, I do not cry over it. I look for the root cause, and I tear it apart. And as I slowly turned to go back inside my small empty house, I looked down at the rest of the mail I had dropped on the wooden porch railing when I first saw the invitation. There was a plain white envelope from my local bank. It had a bright red urgent stamp on the front. I tore it open with shaking fingers. It was a default notice on a $750,000 commercial loan. A massive loan taken out against my fully paid off 50-acre property. A loan secured by a signature that looked exactly like mine, but one I knew for an absolute fact I had never signed. Julian thought I would just fade away silently into the shadows. He thought I was just a tired old man who would blindly accept being discarded like trash. But he had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. He did not realize that the father he had just cruelly thrown away was the only thing standing between him and absolute ruin. The heavy grief in my chest instantly burned away, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. He wanted me to be a ghost. But ghosts have a way of haunting the people who buried them. 15 years ago, the heart of my home stopped beating completely. My beautiful wife, Sarah, was diagnosed with severe leukemia, and the terrible disease tore through her fragile body with a cruel and relentless speed. I remember sitting by her hospital bed for 48 hours straight, holding her frail hand as the life slowly faded from her loving eyes. The medical monitors beeped in that steady, terrifying rhythm that still haunts my darkest nightmares to this very day. Before she took her final breath, she looked at me with hot tears streaming down her pale cheeks and begged me to make absolutely sure our boy Julian would never have to struggle the way we did. I leaned down, kissed her feverish forehead, and made a solemn, unbreakable vow to God and to her that I would give our son the entire world. When she passed away, a massive part of my soul died right there in that cold, sterile hospital room. But I did not have the luxury of falling apart or drowning in my own misery. I had a 17-year-old boy who was looking at me with terrified, confused eyes, expecting me to be his rock. I buried my agonizing grief deep inside my chest, locked it away, and went straight back to work. I did not just go to work. I surrendered my entire physical body to the local freight yard. For the next 15 years, I worked grueling double shifts, crawling under massive smoking diesel rigs and repairing heavy freight loaders that weighed more than a small house. The freight yard was a brutal, unforgiving place that did not care if you were tired or grieving. In the scorching summer, the heat radiating from the black asphalt would bake you alive, and in the dead of winter, the freezing wind would cut straight through my insulated coveralls and settle deep into my aging bones. I spent my days breathing in toxic dark exhaust fumes and tasting bitter metallic dust on my tongue. I lifted heavy steel engine blocks that slowly and permanently destroyed the discs in my lower back. If you look at my hands today, you will see the complete story of my miserable labor. My knuckles are swollen and twisted permanently from severe arthritis. There is thick black engine grease deeply tattooed into my cuticles and pushed far under my fingernails. No amount of industrial chemical soap or vicious scrubbing with a hard bristle brush has ever been able to wash it away. Every single time I cracked a knuckle or pulled a muscle, I simply reminded myself that the physical agony was the necessary price of Julian's bright future. Because I was always working overtime, I missed out on almost everything a normal father gets to enjoy. I missed countless Thanksgiving dinners where I would eat a cold turkey sandwich sitting alone on the rusted bumper of a broken-down semi-truck while the rest of the world was gathered around warm, joyful tables with their families. I missed quiet Christmas mornings. I missed watching football games on lazy Sunday afternoons. I survived on cheap, bitter black coffee and 4 hours of broken sleep a night. I took every single hour of overtime the union would legally allow, and then I begged the yard foreman to let me work extra hours off the books just to earn a few more dollars. Every paycheck I received, I kept only enough to pay for basic cheap groceries and keep the electricity on in our small drafty house. Every single extra dime went straight into a college savings account. Because of my broken back and my permanently stained hands, Julian never had to take out a single student loan. I paid his entire tuition at one of the most prestigious and outrageously expensive out-of-state business schools in the country entirely in cash. I bought his heavy textbooks, his expensive meal plans, and even gave him a generous weekly allowance so he could focus strictly on his elite studies instead of flipping burgers for minimum wage, like I did. I remember the glorious day he finally graduated. I drove 14 hours straight in my old beat-up pickup truck just to sit in the very back row of that massive university stadium. I wore my best church suit, but it was 10 years old and smelled faintly of mothballs and stale air. When the dean called his name and my boy walked across that grand stage to accept his business degree, I cried like a helpless baby. I did not care who saw my tears. I looked up at the bright blue sky and whispered to Sarah that we finally did it. Our boy was going to be somebody important in this world. He was going to wear custom-tailored suits and work in an air-conditioned high-rise office, far away from the dirt and the grime and the back-breaking labor that defined my entire miserable existence. I was so incredibly proud of him, my chest physically ached. I believed with every fiber of my being that I had raised a good, honest, loyal man who understood the immense value of hard work and family devotion. That absolute, unquestioning, blind trust is exactly what led me to make the biggest, catastrophic mistake of my life 3 years ago. Julian came to me with a brilliant-sounding business plan. He wanted to start his own elite corporate consulting firm, but he needed serious capital to get it off the ground. He sat at my worn-out kitchen table wearing a sharp designer suit and laid out all these fancy financial charts and profit projections. He told me that no traditional bank would give a young guy like him the kind of massive loan he needed without completely crushing his dream with high interest rates. He looked me right in the eyes with that same sweet, innocent smile he had when he was a little boy and asked if I believed in him. I did not even hesitate for a single second. I drove straight down to my local bank and emptied out my entire retirement savings. Every single penny I had painstakingly saved for my old age, the money that was supposed to pay for my medical bills when my battered body finally gave out completely. I transferred over $200,000 straight into his business account. I gave him the life savings I had bled for because he was my only child, and there is absolutely nothing a loving father will not do for his son. Looking back on that moment right now, the pure, unconditional love I felt for him makes his current betrayal feel like a rusted, serrated hunting knife twisting slowly and violently in my gut. I trusted him so completely that I never once asked to see his official financial statements. I never interrogated him about how his consulting firm was really doing. I just smiled proudly whenever he pulled into my driveway in a brand new leased luxury car, or bragged about his fancy expensive vacations, assuming my hard-earned investment had helped him achieve the ultimate American dream. I gave him my absolute all. I traded my health, my youth, and my peace of mind so he could stand on top of the world. And how did he repay a lifetime of blood and sweat? He used the very life I gave him to step directly on my throat. He took my money, my blind trust, and the sacred memory of his dead mother and threw them away like worthless garbage just to impress a wealthy aristocratic family who would never in a million years know the real meaning of sacrifice. The sheer agony of realizing that the precious son you worshipped is actually a cold, calculating monster who sees you as nothing more than an embarrassing stepping stone is a pain so profound it completely defies human language. It is a suffocating, terrible darkness that makes you deeply question every single breath you have taken for the last 30 years. I stood on the weathered planks of my front porch, completely frozen. I wanted to grab his expensive shirt and shake him until he remembered who I was. I wanted to remind him of the freezing nights I rubbed his back when he was sick, or the thousands of hours I spent breaking my body so he could walk around in luxury. But my throat was sealed shut. A suffocating lump of shock lodged deep in my windpipe. I looked directly into the eyes of the boy I raised and saw absolutely nothing recognizable. There was no love left. There was no guilt. There was only cold, arrogant irritation. He was waiting impatiently for my answer. He wanted me to quietly accept my humiliating role as the dirty secret he had to hide from his wealthy new family. So I did the only thing my broken heart would allow. I slowly nodded in defeat. I told him in a hoarse voice that I would not come to Atlanta. I promised I would stay far away from his perfect new life. A satisfied smirk crossed his face. He did not bother to say thank you or goodbye. He walked back to his leased sports car and got inside without looking back. I stood perfectly still and watched as the powerful engine roared to life. He backed out of my cracked concrete driveway with aggressive speed and sped off down the quiet rural road. I watched the shiny car disappear, leaving nothing behind but a cloud of dry summer dust. The silence that rushed back into my yard was deafening. It felt heavy, oppressive, and entirely unnatural. I was standing on the exact dirt property where I had taught him to ride a bicycle, but suddenly the world felt completely alien. I turned around and walked back inside my empty house. The screen door slammed shut behind me, echoing like a gunshot in the hallway. I walked heavily into the living room and sank deeply into the faded fabric of my late wife Sarah's favorite armchair. The physical pain in my ruined knees and damaged back was nothing compared to the violent tearing sensation inside my chest. It felt exactly like someone had reached directly through my ribcage and ripped out my beating heart. I sat silently in the dim fading light of the afternoon sun, staring blankly at the framed photographs, sitting proudly on the stone mantel above the fireplace. There was a picture of Julian when he was 10 years old, holding up a small fish we caught together at the lake. There was his high school graduation portrait. There was a beautiful picture of the three of us smiling brightly before the terrible cancer destroyed our happy family. I realized right then, with a sickening wave of suffocating despair, that the sweet, innocent boy in those dusty photographs was completely dead. He simply did not exist anymore. In his place was a ruthless stranger who viewed his own father as nothing more than garbage. I had spent 15 long years working brutal double shifts, breathing in toxic diesel fumes, and destroying my physical health just to be entirely erased from history. He did not just uninvite me to his fancy wedding. He completely deleted my existence. He told his beautiful bride and her influential parents that I was locked away in a medical facility, losing my mind to severe dementia. He maliciously killed me off to build his false legacy. The profound psychological devastation of realizing your only child is deeply ashamed of the very hands that fed him is a nightmare I would never wish on my worst enemy. I leaned my tired head back against the chair and let the hot, bitter tears fall down my weathered face. I wept loudly for my dead wife. I wept for the hard years I threw away. I wept for the crushing emptiness of my ruined life. I do not know exactly how long I sat there drowning helplessly in my miserable grief. The bright sun slowly began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the worn carpet. Eventually, the practical mechanic living inside my brain forced me to open my wet eyes. A good mechanic knows that sitting around crying over a destroyed engine will never fix the broken truck. You have to force yourself to get up and assess the total damage. I wiped my face aggressively with the back of my grease-stained hand and pushed my aching body up out of the armchair. I walked toward the kitchen, hoping to get a glass of cold tap water to soothe my burning throat. That is exactly when I saw it. When I had first walked outside to meet Julian, I had brought the day's mail out with me. I had dropped a small stack of envelopes directly on the kitchen counter when I eagerly opened the wedding invitation. Now that golden invitation was completely stolen out of my hands by my own son. But the rest of the boring mail was still sitting right there next to the old coffee pot. On top of the messy pile was a crisp white envelope from my local commercial bank. It was clearly not a regular monthly statement. It was boldly marked with a thick red urgent warning stamped across the front. My rough hands were still trembling slightly from the severe emotional shock, but a strange, cold, prickling sensation of pure dread started to crawl slowly up the back of my neck. I reached out nervously and tore the top of the sealed envelope open. I pulled out a thick, heavy stack of densely printed legal documents. I grabbed my reading glasses, slid them onto my face, and focused my tired eyes on the very first page. It was a formal bank notice, a final aggressive warning of financial default. My aging brain struggled terribly to process the bold black numbers printed loudly at the top of the page. $750,000. It was a massive commercial business loan. I read the terrifying words again and again, feeling the cold panic violently rise in my dry throat. I had never borrowed $750,000 in my entire life. I lived an entirely simple, debt-free existence. I paid off the final mortgage on my 50-acre property more than 10 years ago with pure blood and sweat. But as I flipped desperately through the heavy stack of legal papers, my blood ran absolutely ice cold. The massive loan was secured directly against my private land, my beautiful 50 acres, the sacred home where my sweet wife died, the only valuable financial asset I had left to my name. Someone had maliciously put my entire life up as collateral for a massive corporate payout. I flipped frantically to the very last page of the contract where the official signatures were securely located. Right there on the bottom line was my name, Raymond Gallagher. But it was absolutely not my handwriting. The loops were entirely too perfect. The pressure of the pen was completely wrong. It was a flawless, highly practiced illegal forgery. And right below my forged signature, listed clearly as the primary corporate beneficiary of the loan, was Julian's luxury business consulting firm. The horrible truth hit me with the destructive, violent force of a runaway freight train. Julian did not just come here today to cruelly ban me from his elite wedding. He did not just come here to hide his embarrassing blue-collar father from his wealthy aristocratic in-laws. He came here to make absolutely sure the dumb old man was still blind and entirely unaware of the trap. He had illegally forged my signature, completely stolen the financial equity of my lifelong home, and funded his entire fake millionaire lifestyle using my stolen property. He desperately needed me to stay hidden and silent, because he knew for a fact that the moment I found out, I would absolutely destroy him. He was actively planning to let the bank forcefully foreclose on my house while he married safely into a wealthy family and secured his bright financial future. He was going to throw me out onto the cold street to die. The agonizing fatherly grief that had been violently crushing my chest just 10 minutes ago instantly evaporated. The hot tears dried completely on my weathered face. The sad sorrow died right there in my quiet kitchen. In its place, a cold, terrifying, and absolute brutal clarity took over my entire mind. My own son had just declared total war on me, and he had absolutely no idea what a betrayed mechanic with nothing left to lose is truly capable of doing. The sun had completely disappeared behind the tree line, leaving my small kitchen in heavy shadows, but I did not bother to turn on the overhead lights. I sat at the table with the thick stack of banking documents, staring at the forged signature until my tired eyes burned. The initial shock had passed, and now a cold, methodical energy was pumping through my veins. I pushed myself up from the wooden chair, ignoring the sharp protest of my damaged knees, and walked straight down the narrow hallway to the spare bedroom. It used to be Julian's room when he was a little boy. Now it was just a storage space for old memories and my heavy metal filing cabinets. I flicked on the small desk lamp and pulled my wire-rimmed reading glasses out of my shirt pocket. The metal drawers screeched loudly as I yanked them open. The sound was harsh and grating, but it matched the violent storm brewing inside my chest. I spent the next 6 hours tearing through every single piece of paper I owned. I pulled out the original property deed I had proudly signed 30 years ago with my beautiful wife Sarah standing right next to me. I pulled out my old tax returns, my union pension statements, and every single piece of financial history that proved I was a responsible, hard-working man. I laid them all out side by side on the faded carpet. I carefully compared the signatures. The man who signed that massive commercial loan had a smooth, confident hand. My real signature is jagged and heavy because my fingers are permanently stiff from decades of wrenching on massive steel engine blocks. Julian had practiced my name. He had sat down somewhere in his fancy apartment and traced the letters of my identity until he could steal it flawlessly. He weaponized the very name I gave him. When the morning sun finally broke through the thin curtains, I had not slept a single second. I washed my face with freezing cold water, put on a clean button-down shirt, and drove my old pickup truck directly into town. My first stop was the county clerk's office. I walked through the heavy glass doors and took a numbered ticket. I forced my posture to remain perfectly straight. I refused to let the young clerks working behind the counter see an old, defeated man. When my number was finally called, I stepped up to the desk and politely requested the complete public property records for my 50-acre parcel. The clerk typed on her keyboard for a moment and then handed me a thick printed file. I sat down on a hard wooden bench in the lobby and opened the folder. The truth was far worse than I could have ever imagined. Julian did not just forge a single piece of paper. He had completely fabricated a comprehensive legal power of attorney. He had hired a shady notary public to officially certify that my mind was failing, and that I had willingly surrendered all financial control of my estate to him. He legally declared me incompetent without me ever stepping foot inside a doctor's office. He used that fraudulent power of attorney to secure the $750,000 loan and attach a massive lien directly to my property. If he missed even a few payments, the bank had the absolute legal right to seize my land, kick me out into the street, and auction off the only home I had left. I left the county building feeling a sickening mixture of rage and physical nausea. But the investigation was not over. I got back into my truck and drove straight to my local bank branch. I have banked at this exact location for over 40 years. The branch manager is a kind older woman named Brenda, who knows me by my first name and always asks about my garden. I walked into her office, closed the door firmly behind me, and sat down in the leather chair. I told Brenda there was a serious discrepancy with my accounts, and I needed a complete printed history of every single transaction connected to my name and my son's name for the past 3 years. Brenda looked concerned, but she quickly accessed the secure system and began printing the statements. As she handed me the warm stacks of paper, I began to read through the itemized lines of Julian's spending. The story told by the bank statements was absolutely repulsive. The massive loan he took out against my home was never used to fund any legitimate business consulting firm. There were no office leases or employee payrolls. Every single dollar was bled dry to fund a fake millionaire lifestyle designed exclusively to impress his wealthy fiancée Chloe and her aristocratic family. I tracked the transactions line by line with my thick, grease-stained finger. I saw monthly lease payments for that silver luxury sports car he drove into my driveway. I saw $20,000 spent at a high-end jewelry store in Atlanta, which I could only assume bought Chloe's dazzling diamond engagement ring. I saw regular charges for 5-star luxury resorts in tropical locations, expensive designer clothing, and private VIP dinners that cost more than I used to make in an entire month of breaking my back at the freight yard. He was playing the role of a highly successful self-made businessman, and he was using my stolen blood and sweat as his personal, limitless ATM. He built an entire kingdom of lies on the back of my lifelong labor. I sat in that quiet bank office feeling my jaw clench so tight my teeth ached. I could handle the financial theft. Money is just money. I could survive being broke because I have been broke my entire life. But what he did next was the ultimate unforgivable sin. It was the absolute final line he crossed that guaranteed I would never show him a single ounce of mercy. I flipped to the very last stack of bank statements Brenda had placed on the desk. This specific account was not supposed to have a debit card attached to it. It was a private, secure savings account I had set up 15 years ago, immediately after my wife passed away. When Sarah died, our small community raised a little bit of money to help with the hospital bills. I never touched a single penny of it. Instead, I added a portion of my overtime pay to it every single month for 15 years. It was Sarah's memorial fund. It had grown to exactly $50,000. My plan was to eventually donate the entire sum to the pediatric cancer ward at the local hospital in her name so that her beautiful legacy would live on and help innocent children. I opened the statement for the memorial fund and my heart completely stopped. The balance printed at the top of the page was 0. I felt the air leave my lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. I stared blindly at the numbers, refusing to believe what my own eyes were showing me. Julian had drained it. He had used his fraudulent power of attorney to bypass the security protocols, and he had completely emptied the sacred account. $50,000 wiped out in a single wire transfer just 2 weeks ago. I traced the destination of the wire transfer and saw that the money was sent directly to an elite catering company in Atlanta. He stole his dead mother's memorial charity fund to pay for the extravagant champagne and fancy appetizers at his fake high society wedding. He took the money meant for sick, dying children and spent it to feed wealthy strangers who thought I was locked away in a mental asylum. I sat perfectly still in the bank manager's office. Brenda asked me in a soft, worried voice if I was okay and if she needed to call the police. I slowly folded the thick stack of papers and placed them carefully inside my leather jacket. I looked up at her and shook my head. I told her I was fine and that I just needed to go home. But I was not fine. Something foundational inside of me had permanently snapped. The last remaining shred of fatherly affection I had for my son completely died and turned to cold gray ash. Forging my name and stealing my land was an act of extreme greed. But stealing his mother's legacy to buy fancy food for people who despised me was an act of pure evil. Julian thought he was dealing with a tired, weak old man who would simply cry and accept his cruel fate. He had absolutely no idea that his monstrous actions had just awakened a sleeping giant. I walked out of the bank and into the bright afternoon sun. I did not feel sad anymore. I did not feel broken. I felt dangerously clear-headed. The mechanic in me was fully activated. Julian had built a beautiful, shiny engine of lies, but I had the official blueprints. I knew exactly which bolts to loosen and which wires to cut to make his entire fake world explode in his face. And I was going to do it in front of every single person he was trying to impress. I drove my old pickup truck back down the long dirt road leading to my property. The heavy tires crunched loudly against the dry gravel, but the familiar sound barely registered in my racing mind. The thick envelope of printed bank statements sat firmly on the passenger seat right next to me, like a loaded weapon. When I parked in the cracked concrete driveway, I just sat there gripping the worn steering wheel for a very long time. I looked at the weathered wooden siding of my house. I built the wide front porch with my own 2 hands 30 years ago. Every inch of this 50-acre property held a sacred, irreplaceable piece of my life and my beautiful marriage to Sarah. And my own flesh and blood son was actively plotting to rip it all away. I turned off the engine and stepped out into the still afternoon air. I walked heavily through the front door and locked the heavy metal deadbolt securely behind me. The house was completely silent. It was that suffocating, heavy kind of silence that usually drives a lonely old widower crazy. But today I welcomed the absolute quiet. I needed unbroken focus. I walked into the dim living room and tossed my truck keys onto the wooden coffee table. I sank down onto the faded sofa and rubbed my aching temples with my grease-stained fingers. The long paper trail I had just uncovered at the local bank was incredibly damning. It absolutely proved the massive financial fraud and the unforgivable theft of Sarah's sacred memorial fund. But I knew how the legal system worked. A smart, expensive corporate lawyer could still try to spin a clever story. Julian could easily lie to the authorities and claim I willingly gave him that money. He could tell a judge that my memory was simply failing, just like he maliciously told his wealthy future-in-laws. I needed something far more concrete. I needed absolute, irrefutable proof of his malicious criminal intent. As I sat there staring blankly up at the ceiling, my tired eyes slowly drifted over to the dark corner of the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Right above the doorway was a standard white plastic smoke detector. I stared at it for a long, quiet moment before a sudden sharp jolt of realization hit my chest. 6 months ago, there was a terrifying string of late-night break-ins down our isolated rural county road. A few of my older, vulnerable neighbors had their wooden barns broken into and their expensive, heavy farming equipment stolen. Because I live completely alone out here in the quiet country, I decided to take a few basic security precautions. I am a retired heavy machinery mechanic, so I have always been relatively handy with small electrical wiring. I drove down to the local hardware store and bought a small, cheap motion-activated security camera. I did not want a big, ugly black device hanging noticeably off my living room wall, so I carefully dismantled the plastic smoke detector in the hallway and wired the tiny camera lens directly into the casing. It was perfectly hidden from plain sight. I synced it directly to my wireless internet router and set it to automatically record small video clips straight to a secure online cloud server whenever someone walked down the narrow hall. I honestly completely forgot the small device was even there. The neighborhood break-ins stopped a few weeks later, and I never had a single reason to log in and check the recorded footage. But yesterday afternoon, right before Julian cruelly delivered his fake wedding invitation and insulted my entire existence, he had briefly stepped inside the house. He claimed he needed to use the restroom. He had walked right down that exact hallway and stood directly underneath the hidden glass lens. I pushed my heavy body off the soft sofa, ignoring the loud, painful popping sound in my bad left knee. I walked quickly into the spare bedroom and sat down at my old, dusty desktop computer. My rough, calloused fingers were actually shaking as I pressed the plastic power button. The old machine hummed loudly and took what felt like an absolute eternity to finally boot up to the main screen. The anxious waiting was pure psychological torture. My heart was pounding violently against my rib cage. I opened the internet browser and typed in the website address for the security camera company. I had to try 3 different times to correctly remember the complicated password I had created 6 months ago. Finally, the main screen loaded and showed a long list of recorded video files organized neatly by date and time. I scrolled down quickly past weeks of empty blank recordings. I found the exact date. Yesterday. I narrowed the timeline down to the specific 20-minute window when Julian's shiny leased silver Porsche was parked out in my driveway. There it was, a 2-minute video file clearly labeled with the exact afternoon timestamp. I took a deep, steadying breath, gripped the plastic computer mouse tightly, and clicked the play button. The video player loaded instantly and expanded across the computer monitor. The picture quality was slightly grainy, but the internal audio microphone was crystal clear. The camera was pointed directly down the narrow hallway, illuminating the faded floral wallpaper. I watched closely as Julian walked into the frame wearing his expensive tailored designer suit. He did not go into the bathroom at the end of the hall. Instead, he stopped right in the middle of the hallway, pulled his fancy smartphone out of his pocket, and immediately dialed a number. He pressed the phone to his ear and leaned casually against the wall. The hidden microphone picked up his voice perfectly in the quiet house. I leaned closer to the bright computer screen, holding my breath completely. I heard my son's voice fill the quiet room. He was laughing. It was a cold, arrogant, mocking laugh that made my stomach aggressively turn with pure disgust. He said, "Chloe, relax. I am telling you, it went perfectly." The dumb old man bought the dementia story, hook, line, and sinker. He actually looked like he was going to cry, but he agreed to stay away. He definitely will not show up to ruin the wedding. He paused for a second, listening intently to whoever was on the other end of the line. Then he let out another cruel, dismissive sigh. He continued talking, and every single word he spoke felt like a heavy steel hammer crushing my skull. He said, "Look, we just need to get through the ceremony tomorrow. Once the wedding is officially done and my name is legally secured on the Sterling family board, we will have absolute unlimited access to the trust funds. You can pay off your little Vegas problem, and I can finally be done with this miserable country life." He paused again and rubbed his forehead, looking incredibly annoyed. Then he delivered the final fatal blow. He said, Do not worry about the bank loan. The old idiot does not even look at his mail. Once I get the sterling money, I will just let the bank quietly foreclose on his rusty house. I will put him in a cheap state-run nursing home where he belongs and use the 50 acres of land to completely cover my tracks. No one will ever care what a crazy old mechanic with severe dementia has to say. It is the perfect foolproof plan. The video clip suddenly ended and the computer screen went entirely black. I sat frozen in the desk chair, staring directly at my own dark reflection in the monitor. The sheer level of pure calculated evil I had just witnessed completely paralyzed my mind. He was not just stealing my money to impress a wealthy girl, he was actively plotting to lock his own flesh and blood father away in a miserable state-run medical asylum just to silence me forever. He planned to let ruthless strangers drag me out of my own home, throw me into a sterile, lonely room, and drug me until I actually did lose my mind. He was going to sell the sacred dirt where his mother died just to cover up his massive financial crimes. The brutal reality of his careless words echoed violently inside my head. You can pay off your little Vegas problem. That specific sentence stuck in my brain like a poisoned arrow. Chloe was not just an innocent, wealthy bride who was being lied to by my son. She had a Vegas problem. She had massive underground gambling debts. They were not just two young kids in love preparing to start a family. They were a pair of ruthless, predatory criminals working closely together to completely drain the innocent Sterling family fortune. I felt a profound, sickening wave of pure, righteous fury rise up from the very bottom of my soul. I reached out and carefully downloaded the video file directly onto a small portable hard drive. I backed the digital file up 3 separate times onto different folders to make absolutely sure it would never be lost or corrupted. Julian thought he was dealing with a frail, confused old man who would simply roll over and accept his cruel manipulation. He thought his expensive suit and his smooth-talking corporate attitude made him infinitely smarter than a blue-collar laborer. But he made the biggest fatal mistake of his miserable life. He underestimated the absolute relentless determination of a father who has completely nothing left to lose. I did not feel sad anymore. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly unplugged the small hard drive, slipped it securely into the front pocket of my heavy denim jacket, and stood up from the wooden desk. I had the official financial records. I had the proof of the stolen charity funds. And now I had his full, arrogant confession recorded in pristine digital audio. The trap was fully set, and I was holding the only key. I sat at my dusty computer desk staring at the glowing black screen for a very long time. Julian had called them upper crust. He had made them sound like arrogant, aristocratic snobs who would look down their noses at a man with heavy engine grease permanently tattooed under his fingernails. I needed to know exactly who these people were. I needed to know if they were heartless monsters just like my son, or if they were entirely innocent victims walking blindly into a brutal slaughterhouse. I opened the internet browser and slowly typed in the names Richard and Vivian Sterling in Atlanta. The search results loaded instantly, and what I saw completely shattered the false, arrogant narrative Julian had built. The Sterlings were not stuck-up socialites who inherited old money and sat around judging the working class. They were a deeply respected Black American family who had built a massive, incredible real estate empire from absolute scratch. I clicked on a recent lengthy magazine article profiling Richard Sterling. As I read the story, my heart sank with a profound sense of heavy recognition. Richard grew up dirt poor in a rough, neglected neighborhood. He started his long career swinging a heavy steel hammer as a union apprentice carpenter, just like I started out turning massive wrenches in the freezing freight yard. He and his beautiful wife Vivian had worked side by side for 40 grueling years, taking incredible financial risks and sacrificing their youth to build their company. They were incredibly famous throughout Atlanta for their generous local philanthropy. They funded massive trade school scholarships for inner-city kids and built affordable safe housing for single mothers. Looking at their warm, smiling faces on my computer screen, I felt a deep, profound sense of kinship. I zoomed in on a picture of Richard shaking hands at a charity event. I could clearly see the thick scars on his knuckles and the tired, heavy lines around his kind eyes. Richard Sterling was a man who intimately knew the true, brutal value of an honest day's work. He was a self-made man with rough, calloused hands of his own. These were genuinely good, honest, hardworking people. And my vicious, greedy son was actively preparing to completely destroy their entire lifelong legacy. But something still felt incredibly wrong about the whole shiny picture. If the Sterlings were such smart, grounded, protective people, how did a slick-talking, manipulative liar like Julian manage to infiltrate their tight inner circle so easily? I needed to know much more about the beautiful bride. I needed to know exactly who Chloe Sterling was, and why a woman from such a powerful family would choose a man who was actively funding his fake life with his elderly father's stolen money. A simple internet search was not going to give me the dark, ugly, hidden truths I was desperately looking for. I needed a trained professional. I reached deep into my bottom desk drawer and pulled out my old worn leather address book. I flipped through the yellowed, crinkled pages until I found the name Mike Higgins. Mike and I used to work the heavy diesel loaders together 30 long years ago. He was a tough, brilliant man who took a nasty, terrible fall off a wet flatbed truck, shattered his pelvis, and had to retire early on a medical union discharge. Instead of giving up and feeling sorry for himself, Mike got his private investigator license and spent the last 2 decades doing intense corporate background checks and tracking down dangerous skip tracers across state lines. I picked up my cell phone and dialed his number, hoping he was still in the business. When Mike finally answered, his voice was as rough and grating as heavy sandpaper, but he remembered me instantly. I did not waste his valuable time with useless, polite pleasantries. I told him my only son was involved in a massive, devastating financial fraud, and I needed him to run a deep, comprehensive, aggressive background check on his future wife, Chloe Sterling. I told him I needed to know every single dirty secret she had buried in the dark. Mike did not ask any useless emotional questions. He did not judge me, did not judge. He just told me he would dig into the dirt and call me back when he had something solid. The waiting was absolute psychological agony. I paced the old wooden floors of my empty, quiet house for 2 straight days, drinking pot after pot of bitter black coffee and listening to the cold wind howl violently against the window panes. Every time a car drove past my driveway, my heart hammered violently against my ribs. Finally, on Thursday evening, my cell phone buzzed loudly on the kitchen counter. It was Mike. He told me to sit down immediately because what he had just found was going to make my old head spin. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter tightly until my knuckles turned bright white and told him to give it to me straight. Mike had dug incredibly deep into Chloe's financial history, avoiding her glossy, fake social media pages and looking directly at her encrypted banking records and offshore travel logs. The truth was absolutely horrifying. Chloe Sterling was not the innocent, wealthy princess Julian had portrayed her to be. She was a deeply troubled, desperate woman living a highly dangerous double life. Mike uncovered a massive, terrifying trail of underground gambling debts. Over the past 5 long years, Chloe had developed a severe destructive addiction to high-stakes poker and illegal underground sports betting. She had completely drained her personal trust fund accounts, her savings, and her investment portfolios. When the legal money ran out, she had quietly borrowed millions of dollars from very dangerous, violent loan sharks out in Las Vegas. She was completely drowning in massive illegal debt, and her wealthy, hardworking parents had absolutely no idea. Richard and Vivian had cut off her direct access to the family business accounts several months ago, hoping to force her to finally become financially independent and responsible. They thought they were teaching their spoiled daughter a valuable, tough lesson in personal responsibility. They had absolutely no idea they were actually pushing a desperate, drowning addict directly into the waiting, eager arms of a professional, ruthless grifter. Mike carefully explained the rest of the complicated puzzle, and the sheer, terrifying brilliance of their evil, coordinated plan made the blood in my veins run completely ice cold. Chloe could not simply ask her strict, hardworking parents for the millions she desperately needed to pay off her dangerous, illegal gambling debts. They would never allow it, and they would demand she seek professional medical help. But Mike had managed to pull a confidential copy of the Sterling family trust documents from a quiet contact down at the county courthouse. There was a very specific, strict legal clause buried deep inside the heavy paperwork. If Chloe married a legitimate partner who met certain strict professional and financial corporate requirements, she would automatically trigger a massive unfreezing of restricted family assets. She would instantly gain independent legal control over a massive $20 million slice of Vivian and Richard's commercial real estate portfolio. That was the entire sickening reason Julian had stolen my house and forged my signature. He desperately needed that $750,000 bank loan to build a fake corporate portfolio that perfectly matched the strict legal requirements of the Sterling family trust document. They were absolutely not two young, innocent kids hopelessly in love. They were a ruthless, predatory, sophisticated grifter team. Julian brought the fake business credentials funded entirely by my stolen blood, sweat, and tears. Chloe brought the golden key to her parents' massive generational fortune. Once they stood in front of a priest, said their holy vows, and signed the legal marriage certificate, the binding legal clause would automatically activate. They would instantly liquidate Vivian and Richard's hard-earned life assets, pay off the violent Vegas loan sharks, and walk away with millions of dollars in clean, untraceable cash. They were going to completely bankrupt two innocent elderly people who had spent 40 hard years building a beautiful legacy for their community. Julian was not just robbing his father to buy fancy clothes. He was actively plotting to entirely destroy a good, honest, hardworking family who trusted him. When Mike finally hung up the phone, the heavy silence in my dark kitchen was absolutely deafening. The burning anger inside my chest had completely solidified into something terrifyingly calm, dark, and heavy. Julian thought I was just a useless piece of collateral damage. He thought he could use my dead wife's sacred charity money and my lifelong home as a cheap, disposable stepping stone to execute his master heist. He did not realize that by completely destroying my life, he had entirely freed me from any fatherly obligations I ever had to protect him. The Sterlings did not know me at all. They thought I was a crazy old man locked away in a dirty medical asylum, losing my mind. But Richard and Vivian were my kind of people. They were honest workers. They were dedicated builders. And I made a silent, unbreakable vow right there in my dark kitchen that I was not going to let my monster of a son tear down their beautiful house. I was going to pack my bags, drive straight down to Atlanta, and burn his entire fake world to the ground. I sat in my dark kitchen for what felt like hours after I hung up the phone with Mike. The terrible truth about Chloe and her massive underground gambling debts hung heavily in the stale air. The grand, terrifying puzzle was finally complete. I knew exactly how my son planned to use my stolen property and his dead mother's charity money to completely bankrupt an innocent family. A lesser man might have completely broken down right then and there. A weaker father might have called the local police in a blind panic or driven straight to Julian's fancy apartment to scream and demand answers. But I did not do any of those things. I reached up with my rough, calloused hands and wiped the final tears from my weathered face. The profound, agonizing grief that had been suffocating me for the past 48 hours suddenly evaporated. It was entirely gone. In its place, a cold, dark, and incredibly focused energy took absolute control of my mind. I am a master heavy machinery mechanic. For 40 years, I made my living diagnosing massive catastrophic failures in complicated diesel engines. When a massive steel engine block cracks under extreme pressure, you do not stand around crying over the broken metal. You do not yell at the leaking oil. You put on your heavy leather work gloves. You grab your torque wrench and you systematically tear the entire corrupted machine apart piece by piece until you expose the absolute root of the dangerous problem. You become cold. You become methodical. You become completely ruthless in your surgical teardown. That is exactly how I decided to view my own flesh and blood son. Julian was no longer my sweet boy. He was a critically dangerous, malfunctioning machine that urgently needed to be dismantled before he could destroy anyone else. To properly rebuild a completely destroyed engine, you have to work in absolute silence. You cannot let the machine know what you are doing until the very last bolt is removed. I knew that if Julian suspected even for a single second that I had discovered his massive financial crimes, he would instantly panic. He and Chloe would immediately liquidate whatever stolen cash they still had and disappear into the wind, leaving the innocent Sterling family completely ruined. and leaving me completely homeless. I had to play my specific part perfectly. I had to become the exact, pathetic, useless victim he confidently believed me to be. The very next morning, my cell phone rang loudly on the wooden coffee table. I looked down at the bright, glowing screen and saw Julian's name. My chest tightened with pure disgust, but I took a deep, steadying breath to calm my racing heart. I answered the phone, but I did not use my normal strong voice. I forced my throat to constrict. I made my breathing sound incredibly shallow and weak. I let my voice tremble just enough to sound like a deeply confused, defeated old man who was slowly losing his grip on reality. Julian did not even bother to say hello. His voice was sharp, tight, and entirely strictly business. He asked me if I was still planning to respect his wishes and stay completely away from his wedding in Atlanta. He wanted to make absolutely sure his embarrassing blue-collar father was safely hidden away in the dark. I gripped the plastic edge of the kitchen counter so hard my swollen, arthritic knuckles turned completely white, but I kept my voice perfectly pathetic. I told him he was absolutely right. I told him my bad knee was acting up terribly and that I was feeling incredibly confused lately. I even threw in a deliberate, heartbreaking lie to really sell the fake dementia story he had maliciously fed to his wealthy new family. I softly told him that I needed to stay home because I was worried Sarah might come back from the grocery store and get worried if I was not sitting in my armchair. Sarah had been dead for 15 years. I hated using my beautiful late wife's memory as a cheap prop, but I knew it was the ultimate bait. I heard Julian let out a heavy sigh of profound relief on the other end of the line. He did not sound sad that his elderly father was hallucinating about his dead mother. He did not ask if I needed to see a medical doctor. He sounded incredibly thrilled that my mind was finally breaking down exactly like he had planned. He told me to just stay inside the house, lock the heavy doors, and get some rest. He promised he would call me in a few weeks when he got back from his expensive tropical honeymoon. He hung up the phone without ever saying I love you. The sheer monstrous arrogance of his voice would have normally crushed my soul, but today it simply fueled my burning righteous fire. He bought the entire act hook, line, and sinker. He was absolutely convinced the dumb old mechanic was completely neutralized. He thought he had a perfectly clear path to steal millions of dollars. With the fake phone call successfully out of the way, I immediately shifted into the final preparation phase. I drove my dusty pickup truck down to the local office supply store and bought the thickest black leather 3-ring binder I could find, along with a box of clear protective plastic sleeves. When I got back to my quiet house, I cleared off the entire wooden dining room table and began to carefully assemble my heavy ammunition. This was not going to be a messy, emotional screaming match. This was going to be a flawless, undeniable legal execution. I needed the physical evidence to be completely bulletproof. I started with the original property deed to my 50 acres of land. I slid it carefully into the very first clear plastic sleeve to establish absolute proof of my legal ownership. Right behind it, I placed the thick stack of fraudulent bank documents I had secured from Brenda, the bank manager. I took a bright yellow highlighter and carefully marked every single forged signature Julian had illegally placed on the massive commercial loan application. I highlighted the exact financial dates and the specific routing numbers that completely proved he had funneled $750,000 of stolen equity directly into his fake corporate consulting accounts. Next, I placed the devastating bank records that showed the complete draining of Sarah's Sacred Memorial Charity Fund. I made absolutely sure the line showing the $50,000 wire transfer to the fancy Atlanta wedding caterers was highlighted so brightly it practically burned the eyes. I wanted the wealthy Sterling family to see exactly how their extravagant, expensive champagne was being cruelly paid for with money meant for dying sick children. I wanted them to fully understand the absolute pure evil they were inviting into their protected home. After the painful banking documents, I included the comprehensive investigative dossier my friend Mike had compiled on the beautiful, dangerous bride. I included the encrypted offshore banking logs, the aggressive, threatening text messages from the violent Las Vegas loan sharks, and the detailed summaries of Chloe's massive illegal underground sports betting debts. I organized the paperwork perfectly to show exactly how her terrible financial desperation directly aligned with the strict legal clauses buried inside the Sterling Family Trust Fund. I made it painfully obvious that their sudden romantic engagement was nothing more than a calculated, desperate corporate merger designed to completely steal $20 million from Vivian and Richard. Finally, I took the small digital hard drive containing the hidden security camera footage. The crystal-clear audio recording of Julian standing in my hallway, casually plotting to throw me into a miserable state, run medical asylum, and forcefully foreclose on my house. I placed the small black drive into a secure zippered pouch at the very front of the thick binder. It was the absolute final nail in his shiny, expensive coffin. It was the undeniable proof of his malicious, premeditated criminal intent. I closed the heavy black binder. It felt incredibly thick and substantial in my rough hands. It was easily 2 inches thick and packed entirely with pure, highly explosive truth. It was a complete chronological roadmap of their incredible greed and their absolute moral bankruptcy. I packed a small, weathered canvas duffel bag with a few clean shirts, my shaving kit, and the dark suit I had worn to my wife's funeral. I did not know exactly how many days I would need to stay down in Atlanta, but I knew I was not coming back to my quiet rural home until the job was completely finished. I stood alone in my hallway one last time and looked around the empty, quiet house. I looked at the faded floral wallpaper and the old wooden floors where Julian used to play with his toy trucks when he was just an innocent little boy with a bright smile. I mourned the complete death of that sweet child days ago. The man waiting for me in Atlanta was a dangerous, ruthless predator wearing my son's face. I zipped my canvas travel bag completely shut and picked up the heavy black binder of evidence. I walked out the front door, locked the heavy deadbolt firmly behind me, and climbed up into the driver's seat of my old, reliable pickup truck. I turned the ignition key, and the heavy diesel engine roared perfectly to life. I put the truck into drive and headed straight down the long gravel road toward the interstate highway. I was driving straight into the heart of their wealthy upper-crust world, and I was bringing an absolute storm of justice right to their front door. The drive from my quiet rural home down to the sprawling massive city of Atlanta took exactly 12 exhausting hours, but I did not turn on the radio a single time. I sat alone in the cab of my rusted old pickup truck, gripping the worn steering wheel until my arthritic knuckles throbbed. I listened to the steady, heavy hum of the diesel engine and ran the entire complicated plan through my mind over and over again. I knew for an absolute fact that I could not pull this execution off completely alone. If I just walked right up to the front door of Richard and Vivian Sterling and started screaming about my son, they would never believe me. They were wealthy, highly insulated people who naturally protected their own family first. They would look at my cheap clothes, my worn-out boots, and my grease-stained hands, and they would immediately assume I was just a crazy, desperate old man trying to extort their wealthy family for a quick financial payout. Julian had already successfully planted the terrible lie that my mind was completely gone. I needed an inside man. I needed someone inside their heavily guarded family fortress who had the exact legal power and the absolute ruthless intellect to help me drop the guillotine on this massive fraud. That man was Andre Sterling. Mike, the private investigator, had given me a very detailed, comprehensive file on Chloe's older brother. Andre was a 36-year-old, highly successful corporate attorney. He was fiercely protective of his parents' hard-earned legacy and their massive real estate empire. He was known throughout the elite Atlanta legal circles as a ruthless, brilliant shark who absolutely despised lazy, entitled people trying to cut corners. He was the exact, complete opposite of his spoiled, degenerate sister. I pulled my dusty truck into the crowded downtown business district just as the sun was starting to set. The towering glass skyscrapers reflected the bright city lights, making my tired eyes ache. I found the massive corporate building where Andre worked and drove my old, noisy truck down into the expensive underground parking garage. The garage smelled like fresh concrete and expensive imported car exhaust. I parked my truck in a dark corner far away from the elevator banks, and I sat in the cold cab for 3 straight hours, waiting patiently in the dark. I am a retired, heavy machinery mechanic. I know exactly how to be patient. I know how to sit perfectly still in the freezing cold and wait for the exact right moment to strike. Finally, around 8 o'clock in the evening, The heavy metal doors of the private VIP elevator slid open. I watched from the deep shadows as Andre Sterling walked out and headed straight toward a sleek black Mercedes sedan parked in the reserved executive spaces. He looked exactly like the professional photographs Mike had sent me. He was a tall, powerfully built black American man wearing an immaculate tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my truck. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and moved with the quick, confident stride of a man who commanded absolute respect in every single room he entered. I waited until he clicked his electronic key fob to unlock his car doors. The headlights flashed brightly in the dim garage. I took a deep, steadying breath, stepped out of the heavy shadows, and walked directly into his line of sight. Andre immediately stopped dead in his tracks. His sharp, intelligent eyes locked onto me, and his entire body instantly shifted into a defensive, highly protective stance. He did not look scared. He looked highly annoyed and completely ready for a physical fight. I knew exactly what I looked like to him. I was a rough, older white man with a heavily lined, weathered face, wearing a cheap discount suit, standing uninvited in a secure private corporate garage. He naturally assumed I was either a dangerous lunatic or a desperate beggar who had somehow slipped past the lobby security guards. He raised his free hand and spoke in a deep, commanding voice that echoed loudly off the concrete walls. He told me to stop right there and back away from his vehicle immediately, or he was going to call the building security and the local police. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands in surrender or show a single ounce of fear. I simply stopped walking, stood perfectly straight, and looked him directly in the eyes. I kept my voice incredibly low, calm, and completely devoid of any threatening emotion. I told him my name was Raymond Gallagher. I told him I was Julian's father. And I told him I had driven 12 hours straight through the night to save his innocent parents from being financially slaughtered by my own flesh and blood. The sudden mention of Julian's name made Andre's jaw clench tightly. A look of complete, absolute disgust flashed quickly across his handsome face. He obviously believed the terrible, malicious lies Julian had spread about my supposed severe dementia. He gripped his heavy leather briefcase tighter and told me in a sharp, patronizing tone that Julian had warned the family I was severely mentally unwell. He told me to go back home to my medical facility before I embarrassed myself any further, and forced him to involve the legal authorities. He actually reached into his tailored suit pocket to pull out his cell phone to dial for help. I did not argue with him. Arguing with a highly trained, arrogant corporate lawyer is a completely useless waste of breath. I simply reached into my weathered canvas duffel bag, pulled out the heavy 2-inch thick black leather binder, and slammed it loudly directly onto the pristine hood of his expensive black Mercedes. The heavy slapping sound echoed sharply like a gunshot through the empty concrete garage. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I did not care if he called the police. In fact, I told him the police would eventually need to see exactly what was inside that thick binder anyway. I told him he could either spend the next 10 minutes reading the absolute, undeniable truth, or he could spend the rest of his entire life watching his parents' hard-earned real estate empire burn to the ground because his precious little sister was a desperate underground gambling addict. The absolute, cold, chilling certainty in my rough voice made him freeze completely. The sudden mention of his sister's hidden gambling addiction was the exact psychological trigger I desperately needed to hit. Andre slowly lowered his cell phone. He stared at me for a long, quiet moment, analyzing my steady posture and my perfectly clear, focused eyes. He did not see a crazy old man suffering from severe dementia. He saw a deeply serious, highly dangerous father holding a loaded weapon. He cautiously stepped forward, unlatched the heavy leather binder, and opened the very first plastic page. I stood in absolute total silence as Andre Sterling began to read. I watched his sharp, intelligent eyes scan the heavy legal documents illuminated by the harsh fluorescent garage lights. He started with the forged property deeds and the massive commercial loan applications. I could physically see his brilliant corporate legal mind instantly processing the catastrophic financial fraud. He saw the brightly highlighted forged signatures. He saw the exact routing numbers absolutely proving Julian had stolen his entire fake millionaire lifestyle straight from my old calloused hands. But Andre was a tough, deeply skeptical lawyer. Financial fraud from a greedy future brother-in-law was terrible, but it was not enough to completely shatter his deeply held worldview. He still thought Julian was just a lone wolf scammer. Then he turned the thick plastic page to the devastating banking records showing the completely drained charity memorial fund. He read the exact detailed transaction line showing Julian violently draining his dead mother's sacred cancer charity money to specifically pay for the extravagant Sterling wedding caterers in Atlanta. Andre's broad chest visibly heaved. The sheer, profound psychotic sickness of that action deeply offended his strong moral compass. I could see the pure disgust radiating from his clenched jaw. He was starting to realize exactly what kind of monster was sleeping under his parents' expensive roof. But the absolute final killing blow came when he reached the comprehensive investigative dossier on his own sister Chloe. He stared in absolute horrific silence at the encrypted offshore banking logs and the violent threatening text messages from the ruthless Las Vegas loan sharks. He read the exact detailed professional breakdown of how Chloe's massive illegal underground sports betting debts perfectly aligned with the strict financial release clauses buried deep inside his own parents' private family trust fund. I did not have to explain a single word of the complicated, sophisticated scheme to him. He was a brilliant corporate attorney who dealt with massive financial mergers every single day. He connected the dark, terrible dots in a matter of seconds. He realized instantly that their sudden romantic engagement was nothing more than a calculated, desperate corporate merger designed to completely steal $20 million from Vivian and Richard. He finally reached the small, secure, zippered pouch securely taped to the back cover containing the digital hard drive with the hidden security camera footage. I softly told him exactly what was on that audio recording. I told him he would hear Julian casually laughing in my hallway about throwing me into a miserable state-run medical asylum just to completely cover up the massive theft of the Sterling family money. I told him my son was planning to leave me to die in a sterile room so he could walk away, a rich man. Andre slowly closed the heavy black binder. He leaned his back heavily against the cold hood of his expensive car and stared out into the dark, empty garage. The heavy silence between us was incredibly thick and completely suffocated by shared, devastating grief. He looked exactly like a strong man who had just been violently punched directly in the stomach by a heavyweight fighter. He had spent his entire adult life aggressively protecting his parents' massive corporate empire from outside predators, only to suddenly realize the most dangerous venomous snake was actually his own beautiful sister living right inside the warm family home. The absolute betrayal of blood is a pain that completely transcends race, class, and background. It is a universal agonizing poison. When Andre finally pushed himself off the car and looked back at me, his sharp dark eyes were no longer defensive, arrogant, or angry at me. They were completely filled with a dark, cold, calculating fury directed entirely at the two young monsters who were actively planning to destroy our innocent families. He looked deeply at my rough, swollen, grease-stained hands and my cheap, worn-out suit. He saw the massive, painful physical sacrifices I had made for a son who turned out to be a ruthless, sociopathic criminal. And I looked at his immaculate, tailored clothing, his expensive car, and his fierce, protective stance. And I saw a deeply honorable, loyal son who loved his parents just as fiercely and purely as I had loved mine. We were two men from completely, entirely different worlds. We were separated by massive wealth, by extreme class division, and by race. But in that dark, quiet underground parking garage, none of those superficial societal things mattered even a tiny bit. We were simply two strong, protective men who absolutely refused to let evil, greedy parasites destroy the innocent people we fiercely loved. Andre stood up perfectly straight, adjusting his suit jacket. He reached out his right hand toward me. I looked at his clean, perfectly manicured fingers, and then I reached out my swollen, arthritic, grease-stained hand and gripped his incredibly firmly. We shook hands in the quiet, dark shadows of the concrete garage. It was not a standard, polite corporate greeting or a casual business deal. It was a heavy, silent, unbreakable blood oath. It was a powerful, devastating alliance forged entirely in the hot, burning fires of absolute betrayal. Andre looked me dead in the eye, and his voice was as cold and sharp as a surgeon cutting through bone. He told me we are not just going to stop this wedding, Ray. He said we are going to let them walk right up to the absolute edge of the cliff. We are going to let them put on their fancy clothes and smile for the cameras and think they have completely, absolutely won. And then we are going to drop the hammer and burn their entire fake world straight to the ground in front of every single person they know. I looked at the fierce determination burning in his eyes, and I nodded my head exactly once. The blueprint for absolute ruthless justice was firmly set. Andre escorted me out of the cold concrete parking garage and led me up to his private executive office on the 42nd floor of the massive corporate building. The entire office was completely dark and empty at this late hour. We walked past rows of pristine glass cubicles until we reached his personal suite at the very end of the long hallway. He unlocked the heavy wooden door and turned on a small warm brass desk lamp. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the bright glowing Atlanta City skyline, but I did not care about the beautiful scenery. I sat down heavily in a thick leather guest chair and placed the heavy black binder of evidence directly onto his polished mahogany desk. Andre took off his expensive suit jacket, rolled up the crisp white sleeves of his dress shirt, and sat down in his large leather chair. We were no longer just two angry men standing in a dark garage. We were a specialized tactical unit preparing to completely dismantle a massive criminal operation. I leaned forward and told Andre my initial desperate plan. I told him I wanted to drive straight to Julian's luxury apartment right now, kick the front door completely off its hinges, and drag my son out into the street by his expensive collar. I wanted to call the local police, hand them the forged bank documents, and have Julian locked in a dirty county jail cell before the sun even came up. I wanted to stop the terrible wedding from ever happening. But Andre slowly shook his head. He looked at me with those sharp, intelligent eyes and completely dismantled my emotional blue-collar strategy with cold, brilliant corporate logic. He explained that we were dealing with highly sophisticated, predatory grifters. If we confronted them tonight, Julian and Chloe would immediately realize the entire game was over. They would instantly panic. They would quickly drain whatever stolen cash they still had left from the forged bank loan, wire the money to untraceable offshore accounts, and completely disappear into the wind. They would hire expensive, sleazy defense attorneys to tie the local police up in endless bureaucratic paperwork, claiming the forged signatures were just a simple family misunderstanding. Andre leaned across the heavy oak desk and told me that we could not just wound the snake. We had to completely cut off its head so it could never bite another innocent family ever again. He explained that if we wanted to guarantee they both went to federal prison for a very long time, we needed them to commit the absolute ultimate crime in the most public, undeniable way possible. We needed to let the extravagant wealthy wedding proceed exactly as they had planned. Andre laid out the incredibly precise legal trap he was going to build, and as I listened to his brilliant strategy, I felt a deep, profound respect for his ruthless intellect. The entire criminal conspiracy hinged on one specific legal mechanism. Chloe and Julian were marrying to forcefully trigger a strict clause in the Sterling Family Trust Fund. According to the original legal paperwork, the moment Chloe was officially married to a legitimate corporate partner, she gained immediate independent access to $20 million in liquid real estate assets. Andre explained that the wedding ceremony itself was the perfect, unavoidable trap. During the extravagant reception, Julian and Chloe were scheduled to sit down in a private room with the hired wedding officiant, a state-licensed notary public, and the official Sterling Family Trust lawyers. They were supposed to simultaneously sign their state marriage certificate and the federal trust fund transfer documents. Andre looked me dead in the eye and explained the terrifying beauty of federal law. If they signed those trust transfer documents knowing their entire corporate portfolio was entirely built on a fraudulently obtained bank loan, they would instantly be committing massive federal wire fraud. Because they would be signing the documents in front of a licensed state notary and a religious officiant, they would also be committing undeniable perjury. They would be actively executing a $20 million federal financial crime in front of 300 elite witnesses. There would be absolutely no expensive defense attorney in the entire country who could ever twist or manipulate that pristine level of documented criminal guilt. But we also had to make absolutely sure they never actually touched a single penny of Vivian and Richard's hard-earned money. Andre was the primary legal counsel and the active executor for his parents' massive estate. He told me he was going to secretly log into the secure federal banking portals that very night. He was going to place a hard, silent legal freeze on every single trust account connected to Chloe's name. It was a highly specialized corporate legal maneuver that essentially created a phantom bank account. When Chloe and Julian proudly signed the transfer papers at the wedding, the bank system would automatically accept their signatures and digitally process the transfer request. But because of the silent freeze, the money would never actually move. Instead, the fraudulent digital transfer attempt would instantly generate an emergency red flag and report the massive unauthorized transaction directly to the federal authorities. They would essentially be locking their own prison cell doors from the inside without ever realizing the lock was already broken. Andre had perfectly secured his innocent parents and their beautiful, lifelong legacy. But the brilliant young lawyer was not finished. He turned his sharp focus directly to my terrible situation. Julian had taken out a massive $750,000 commercial loan against my fully paid-off 50-acre property, using a highly illegal, forged power of attorney. If the bank suddenly realized the loan was completely fraudulent, they would immediately freeze the funds, but they might still try to seize my beautiful land to cover their massive corporate losses. I could still end up completely homeless fighting a massive faceless bank in court for the rest of my miserable life. Andre refused to let that happen to me. He pulled a fresh yellow legal pad from his desk drawer and grabbed a heavy gold pen. He told me he was going to use his absolute full power as a senior corporate attorney to build an impenetrable legal fortress around my home. Right there in his quiet, dark office at 2:00 in the morning, Andre drafted an emergency irrevocable protective trust. He carefully explained the complicated legal mechanics as he wrote. By legally transferring my 50 acres of land into this highly specialized irrevocable trust, and backdating the legal protections based on the exact timeline of the bank forgery, my property would instantly become completely untouchable by any commercial bank or debt collector. But the legal maneuver did something far more devastating to Julian. The moment my property was officially absorbed into the protective trust, the commercial loan Julian had fraudulently obtained instantly lost its primary physical collateral. The $750,000 bank loan was no longer just a simple state-level forgery issue. It immediately transformed into a massive federal mortgage fraud because it crossed state lines and directly defrauded a federally insured banking institution. By signing that one piece of paper in Andre's office, I was actively triggering an automatic immediate investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Andre printed the heavy stack of official trust documents from his secure office printer. He laid them out carefully on the polished mahogany desk and handed me the heavy gold pen. I stared down at the thick black ink on the crisp white paper. This was the exact precise moment of no return. Signing these specific documents meant I was officially turning my only child over to the ruthless jaws of the federal justice system. I was actively signing the legal paperwork that would ultimately send the boy I had raised and loved with my entire heart to a cold concrete prison cell for at least 10 long years. A sudden heavy wave of profound sorrow washed over my tired body. I thought about my beautiful late wife Sarah. I thought about the solemn promise I made to her on her tragic deathbed to always protect our sweet boy. I felt my rough grease-stained fingers begin to tremble slightly, holding the cold metal pen. Andre saw the heavy emotional conflict tearing my soul apart. He did not rush me. He did not push the papers closer or try to aggressively convince me. He simply sat back in his leather chair and spoke to me with incredible quiet respect. He told me that a father is supposed to protect his children from the cruel, dangerous world. But sometimes a father has to protect the innocent world from his dangerously cruel children. He reminded me of the hidden camera video. He reminded me of Julian casually laughing about throwing me into a miserable state-run medical asylum to rot away in complete lonely silence. He reminded me of the $50,000 stolen directly from Sarah's Sacred Charity Memorial Fund. Julian had already destroyed the beautiful family we once had. I was simply cleaning up the terrible, dangerous wreckage he left behind. I closed my tired eyes, took a deep, steadying breath, and gripped the gold pen tightly. My hands completely stopped shaking. The heartbroken, grieving father finally stepped aside, and the cold, methodical mechanic completely took over. I pressed the pen firmly against the crisp paper and signed my jagged, heavy signature on every single dotted line. I legally transferred my home into the protective trust. I secured my land and I officially armed the massive explosive trap that would completely obliterate my son's fake billionaire existence. When the final document was signed, Andre carefully gathered the thick stack of papers and locked them securely inside his heavy metal floor safe. The digital lock beeped loudly in the quiet, dark room, sealing the absolute, undeniable truth behind 3 inches of solid, hardened steel. We sat in the quiet office as the first early rays of morning sunlight began to slowly creep over the distant Atlanta skyline. The massive, sprawling city was just starting to wake up, completely, entirely unaware of the catastrophic storm we had just meticulously built. The net was officially cast. It was a flawless, inescapable steel cage constructed entirely from brilliant legal strategy and absolute righteous fury. We had successfully blocked every single possible exit. Julian and Chloe could no longer run. They could no longer hide behind their expensive tailored clothes or their fake, sophisticated smiles. All they had to do now was put on their beautiful, extravagant wedding outfits, walk proudly down the aisle, filled with white roses, and blindly step directly into the massive trap we had laid out for them. Andre stood up from his desk and extended his hand to me one more time. I stood up, ignoring the sharp, painful ache in my bad left knee, and shook his hand firmly. We did not need to say another word to each other. The complete strategy was set in stone. I picked up my empty canvas duffel bag and walked out of the massive corporate building into the cool, crisp morning air. The wedding was exactly 2 days away. I was going to spend the next 48 hours resting my tired body, preparing my mind, and getting ready to attend the most spectacular, unforgettable celebration of justice this wealthy city had ever seen. Julian thought I was safely locked away in a dark room, losing my mind. He had absolutely no idea his worst nightmare was already waiting patiently right outside his front door. I spent the next 48 hours sitting completely alone in a cheap motel room on the extreme outskirts of Atlanta. I paced the worn, thin carpet and drank cup after cup of bitter black coffee, just waiting for the bright sun to finally set on Friday evening. The extravagant rehearsal dinner was scheduled to begin precisely at 7 o'clock at an exclusive, sprawling country club in the downtown financial district. I was obviously not on the pristine, gold-lettered guest list. But Julian had made a very careless, incredibly arrogant mistake when he violently stole his dead mother's charity money to pay for his fancy catered food. When I had carefully read through the thick stack of forged bank statements back home, I immediately recognized the specific name of the elite catering company. The owner was a hardworking man named Thomas. 30 long years ago, Thomas was just a struggling young cook running a broken-down, rusted food truck just outside the freezing Union Freight Yard. I used to fix his busted diesel generator and repair his leaking radiator completely for free so he could keep his small business alive and feed his family. He never forgot that quiet kindness. I called Thomas on his personal cell phone and told him I needed a massive favor. I did not give him the dark, terrible details of the financial fraud. I just told him my only son was getting married, and I needed to be in that specific room without anyone knowing I was actually there. Thomas did not ask any useless questions. He simply told me to meet him at the hidden service loading dock behind the country club at exactly 6 o'clock. When I arrived at the massive stone building, Thomas was waiting quietly by the heavy metal service doors. He handed me a crisp black uniform shirt, a matching heavy apron, and a dark polished plastic name tag. I stripped off my cheap faded flannel shirt right there in the cold alley and put on the tight black uniform. I pulled the black uniform cap down low over my forehead to carefully hide my heavily weathered face. I looked down at my rough, permanently grease-stained hands. They absolutely did not look like the soft, perfectly manicured hands of a high-end luxury waiter. But I knew from decades of hard blue-collar experience that in a dark, crowded room filled with wealthy, arrogant people, nobody ever looks closely at the invisible working help. They only see the shiny silver trays and the expensive poured champagne. Thomas handed me a heavy tray of crystal water glasses and told me to stick exclusively to the deep, dark shadows near the kitchen swinging doors. I walked through the busy, bustling hot kitchen and pushed the heavy wooden door open. The main ballroom was absolutely breathtaking. There were massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the extremely high ceilings, casting a warm, soft golden glow over the immaculate white tables. There were massive, extravagant arrangements of fresh white roses everywhere. And sitting right in the center of the massive room, surrounded completely by the wealthy elite of Atlanta, was my only son. Julian was wearing a tailored dark velvet dinner jacket, laughing brightly and holding a delicate glass of dark red wine. Sitting directly next to him was his beautiful, incredibly dangerous bride, Chloe. She looked absolutely radiant, perfectly masking her massive, illegal, underground gambling debts behind a flawless, highly expensive smile. I stood quietly in the dark, hidden corner of the ballroom, pretending to polish the exact same crystal glass over and over again with a white cloth. My tired heart pounded violently against my ribs. Across the massive, extravagant room, I saw Richard and Vivian Sterling. They were greeting their wealthy corporate guests with warm, genuine smiles. They looked exactly like good, honest, hardworking people who fiercely loved and protected their children. They had absolutely no idea they were actively celebrating their own catastrophic financial execution. And sitting quietly at the very end of the main head table was Andre Sterling. He wore a sharp dark suit, and he was absolutely not smiling at all. He held his crystal water glass tightly, looking directly at Julian with the cold, calculating eyes of a trained sniper waiting patiently for the perfect shot. Andre and I had not spoken a single word since our secret late-night meeting in his dark corporate office, but I knew he had already placed the silent legal freeze on the massive trust accounts. The complicated legal trap was completely armed. All we needed right now was for the ignorant, arrogant rats to blindly step inside. Halfway through the extravagant 5-course meal, the soft, elegant string music suddenly stopped playing. Julian stood up proudly from his chair and picked up a heavy silver spoon. He gently tapped the side of his expensive champagne glass. The sharp, clear ringing sound echoed loudly through the quiet ballroom, drawing every single eye directly to him. The wealthy guests fell completely silent, waiting eagerly for the handsome groom to speak. I stepped slightly out of the deep dark shadows, keeping my head completely down but watching his every single move intensely. Julian cleared his throat and smiled warmly at Chloe. He started talking smoothly about how incredibly blessed he was to be marrying into the beautiful, powerful Sterling family. He talked extensively about their legendary corporate legacy and their generous local charity work, kissing up to Richard and Vivian with absolute sickening perfection. He was a master manipulator, playing the wealthy crowd like a cheap rented fiddle. But then his bright, fake smile slowly faded away. He forced his dark eyes to look deeply sad and troubled. He lowered his smooth voice perfectly, hitting a tone of profound, heavy grief. He told the completely quiet room that his only true regret tonight was that his beloved father could not be sitting at the head table. He said he wished more than anything that the hard-working man who raised him could see him marry the absolute woman of his dreams. A soft, collective sigh of genuine sympathy rippled quickly through the wealthy crowd. Chloe reached out and placed her soft hand gently over his, rubbing his velvet arm to lovingly comfort him. Julian actually forced a single fake tear to roll slowly down his cheek. Then he delivered the absolute most despicable, unforgivable lie I had ever heard in my entire life. He said his father's mind was completely gone. He claimed I was locked away securely in a medical facility, suffering from severe advanced dementia, completely unable to even remember my own name. He painted a tragic, beautiful picture of a brave, loving son who was courageously carrying on despite a devastating personal family heartbreak. He said he knew his father was looking down from somewhere, trapped inside his own broken mind, feeling incredibly proud of the man he had become. The absolute sheer monstrous audacity of his theatrical performance made the warm blood in my veins completely freeze and then instantly boil with pure aggressive rage. I stood firmly in the dark corner, gripping the heavy silver serving tray so hard my swollen arthritic knuckles screamed in pure physical agony. The thick, heavy metal actually bent slightly under the extreme pressure of my calloused thumbs. My breathing became dangerously shallow and completely ragged. Every single protective fatherly instinct inside my soul loudly demanded that I drop the heavy tray, march directly to the brightly lit center of the room, and smash my calloused fist right into his perfectly sculpted lying face. I wanted to grab the microphone from the stand and scream the absolute undeniable truth until my tired lungs bled. I wanted to tell the wealthy clapping crowd that the brave honorable son standing right in front of them had violently stolen his dead mother's sacred charity money to buy the very wine they were happily drinking. I wanted to expose him as a ruthless, predatory criminal. The profound, burning, emotional rage was almost completely blinding. It took every single ounce of my lifelong discipline and physical restraint to stay firmly planted in the dark, invisible shadows. I had to forcefully remind myself over and over again that a premature emotional explosion would completely ruin the flawless legal trap Andre and I had meticulously built. If I screamed right now, they would just drag me out the back door and call me a crazy old man having a mental breakdown. I had to let him finish painting his beautiful fake masterpiece so I could completely destroy it permanently tomorrow. I took a deep, slow, rattling breath and forced my racing heart to calm down. The cold, methodical mechanic took over my brain once again. I looked past Julian's fake tears and scanned the long, elegant table until my eyes locked directly onto Andre Sterling. Andre was absolutely not clapping. He was not smiling sympathetically like the rest of the foolish guests. He was staring straight through the wealthy crowd, directly into the dark hidden corner where I was firmly standing. Even though I was wearing a cheap black uniform and a pulled-down cap, he knew exactly who I was. He saw the heavy silver tray bending under my grip. He saw the absolute quiet fury radiating violently from my chest. Across the massive glittering ballroom, the elite corporate lawyer and the rough blue-collar mechanic shared a single fleeting moment of absolute perfect understanding. Andre slowly raised his heavy crystal water glass toward me. He tilted his strong chin down in a single subtle cold nod. It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement of our shared righteous mission. He was telling me to hold my ground and stay completely invisible. He was telling me that the trap was fully primed and ready to violently snap. I slowly nodded back. I turned around, pushed through the heavy wooden swinging doors, and walked straight out into the cool, quiet night. I had seen exactly what I needed to see. The fake rehearsal dinner was completely over. Tomorrow was the grand wedding. Tomorrow was the absolute end of his fake billionaire world. The bright morning sun slowly crept through the thin curtains of my motel room on Saturday. It was finally the day of the wedding. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress and stared in absolute silence at the dark suit hanging on the back of the bathroom door. It was not a custom-tailored tuxedo. It was a heavy 10-year-old wool suit I bought from a discount department store. The very last time I wore this exact suit was the absolute darkest day of my entire life. I wore it when I stood in the pouring rain and watched the cemetery workers lower my beautiful wife Sarah into the cold ground. I had kept it securely zipped inside a plastic bag in the back of my closet for 15 years. I never wanted to wear it again. But today was not a day for celebration. Today was a day for a funeral. I was going to officially bury the completely fake lying monster my son had become. I stood up, ignoring the painful popping sound in my bad left knee. I took the dark suit off the hanger. It smelled faintly of mothballs, but it was clean. I put on a white button-down shirt and slowly pulled the heavy trousers over my legs. My swollen, arthritic fingers struggled to fasten the small buttons, but I forced them to work. I pulled the wool jacket over my shoulders and looked at my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. I looked exactly like a tired old mechanic wearing a cheap suit. My face was deeply lined with decades of hard labor. My hands were permanently stained with dark engine grease, but my eyes were completely clear and burning with absolute righteous determination. I reached into my canvas travel bag and pulled out a single pristine white rose. It was Sarah's absolute favorite flower. I carefully pinned the delicate white blossom directly to the left lapel of my suit jacket right over my beating heart. I spoke out loud in the quiet, empty room. I told Sarah I was incredibly sorry for what I had to do. I promised her the sacred charity money stolen from her memory would be entirely avenged. While I was standing alone in my cheap motel room miles away, the massive, sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate was buzzing with chaotic, nervous energy. The wedding venue was an absolutely breathtaking historic mansion surrounded by hundreds of acres of perfectly manicured green lawns and massive ancient oak trees. Hundreds of wealthy elite guests were already beginning to arrive in their expensive luxury cars. Caterers were carrying silver trays of expensive champagne, and musicians were tuning their elegant string instruments. The air was incredibly thick with heavy, expensive perfume and the joyful sounds of a high society celebration. But inside the private master suite on the second floor of the massive mansion, a completely different kind of storm was violently brewing. Andre Sterling had arrived at the lavish estate 2 hours before the ceremony. He did not go to the groomsmen's suite to drink expensive scotch with Julian. He walked directly up the grand staircase and knocked firmly on the heavy oak door of his parents' private dressing room. Richard and Vivian Sterling were inside getting dressed for what they completely believed was going to be the absolute happiest day of their daughter's life. Richard was adjusting his custom silk tie, and Vivian was having her makeup professionally done by expensive artists. Andre stepped inside the massive room, dismissed the makeup artists, and firmly locked the heavy wooden door behind him. He carried the thick black leather binder tightly in his strong hands. The exact same binder I had given him in the dark concrete parking garage. Andre asked his parents to sit down on the velvet sofa. He did not try to soften the terrible catastrophic blow. He knew his parents were incredibly strong, resilient people who demanded the absolute truth no matter how much it deeply hurt. Andre opened the heavy black binder and laid the entire sickening reality completely bare right in front of them. He showed them the fraudulent commercial loan applications with my forged signatures. He showed Richard the exact banking records proving Julian was absolutely broke and had entirely funded his fake millionaire lifestyle using stolen equity from my old calloused hands. Then Andre showed them the comprehensive investigative dossier on Chloe. Richard Sterling leaned forward and stared at the encrypted offshore banking logs. He read the violent, threatening text messages from the ruthless Las Vegas loan sharks demanding millions of dollars from Chloe. He saw the exact detailed legal breakdown explaining how Chloe and Julian were actively using the wedding ceremony to forcefully trigger the strict release clause in the Sterling Family Trust Fund. They were completely planning to liquidate $20 million of Richard and Vivian's hard-earned commercial real estate empire the absolute second the marriage certificate was signed. The emotional reaction inside that private room was absolutely devastating. Vivian Sterling covered her face with her shaking hands and wept bitterly. She cried for the beautiful, innocent daughter she thought she had raised, and she cried for the complete, horrifying betrayal. But Richard Sterling did not cry a single tear. Richard was a proud, self-made Black American man who had grown up in absolute brutal poverty. He had built his massive real estate empire with his own two bare hands, working long, grueling hours and sacrificing everything for his family. He respected hard, honest labor above absolutely everything else in the world. He completely despised lazy, entitled parasites who tried to steal what they did not earn. When he fully realized his own daughter was a predatory monster plotting to bankrupt him to pay off illegal underground sports bets, his initial profound sadness instantly transformed into absolute terrifying fury. Richard stood up from the velvet sofa. His broad chest heaved heavily with pure aggressive anger. He looked at the bank statement showing how Julian had maliciously stolen $50,000 from my dead wife's Sacred Cancer Charity Fund to pay for the extravagant catering downstairs. Richard completely understood the immense physical pain of a working-class man. He knew exactly what it meant to sacrifice your entire physical body for your family. The absolute sheer disrespect of a young, arrogant punk stealing an old mechanic's lifelong home and his dead wife's charity. Money deeply offended Richard's strong moral code. He looked at Andre with cold, burning eyes and asked his son exactly what they needed to do to completely destroy them. Andre quickly explained the flawless legal trap we had meticulously built in his dark office. He told his parents about the silent legal freeze he had already placed on the massive trust accounts. He told them about the irrevocable protective trust covering my 50-acre property, which instantly turned Julian's forged commercial loan into a massive federal crime. Andre explained that if they confronted Julian and Chloe right now, the grifters would simply deny everything, panic, and completely run away. Andre told his parents they needed the two criminals to walk proudly down the aisle and sign the state marriage certificate and the federal trust transfer documents simultaneously in front of the licensed notary. They needed them to officially commit federal wire fraud and blatant perjury in front of 300 elite witnesses. It was an incredibly agonizing psychological test for the loving parents. They had to forcefully wipe the bitter tears from their eyes, put on their expensive, beautiful clothes, and walk downstairs into the massive, crowded ballroom. They had to smile warmly for the professional photographers, shake hands with their wealthy corporate friends, and pretend they were absolutely thrilled to welcome my lying son into their prestigious family. They had to sit perfectly still in the front row and watch their daughter say holy vows in front of a priest, completely knowing she was actively plotting to destroy their entire lifelong legacy. Vivian wiped her wet face with a silk handkerchief and looked directly at her husband. Richard reached out and held her hand incredibly tightly. They were a powerful united front. They had survived absolute poverty and built an empire together. They were absolutely not going to let two arrogant, greedy children tear down their beautiful house. Richard nodded his head exactly once. He told Andre they would play their parts perfectly. They agreed to let the extravagant, beautiful ceremony proceed just far enough to completely lock the heavy steel trap. Andre gathered the thick stack of devastating legal documents, placed them securely back into the black binder, and unlocked the heavy wooden door. The trap was absolutely locked and completely loaded. Miles away, I stepped out of my cheap motel room and walked slowly toward my dusty pickup truck. I climbed into the driver's seat, turned the ignition key, and headed straight toward the multi-million-dollar estate. The incredibly tense morning air was perfectly still. I drove down the long highway knowing that when the bright sun finally set tonight, the absolute, completely unpredictable climax of this incredible storm would leave my arrogant son with absolutely nothing but handcuffs and complete total ruin. I was ready. I stood alone in the cool, dark stone corridor just outside the main ballroom of the lavish estate. The heavy, solid oak doors separating me from the grand ceremony were absolutely massive. I could feel the deep vibrations of the elegant string quartet playing a beautiful classical melody right through the thick wood. The air in the hallway smelled strongly of fresh, expensive white roses and the sweet scent of burning beeswax candles. I adjusted the lapel of my cheap dark wool suit and gently touched the fragile white rose pinned right over my beating heart. I closed my tired eyes for a brief moment and thought about my beautiful wife, Sarah. I asked her to give me the ultimate strength to do what I had to do. I listened intently to the muffled sounds of the wedding ceremony proceeding exactly on schedule. The priest was speaking in a warm, comforting tone, talking about the sacred, eternal bonds of holy matrimony and the incredible importance of absolute honesty in a marriage. The absolute sheer hypocrisy of those sacred words being spoken over my lying, criminal son and his predatory bride made my stomach violently churn. I checked my heavy silver pocket watch. It was exactly time. Andre Sterling had meticulously arranged for me to wait in this specific hidden hallway. He had given me the exact visual cue to look for. Through a tiny crack between the heavy wooden doors, I could clearly see the entire breathtaking scene. There were over 300 of the wealthiest, most elite corporate citizens in Atlanta, sitting in perfectly aligned rows of velvet chairs. The room was bathed in golden sunlight pouring through the massive stained glass windows. At the very front of the long white aisle stood Julian. He looked incredibly handsome in his custom-tailored designer tuxedo. He was smiling warmly, holding Chloe's soft hands in his own. Chloe looked like an absolute flawless angel in a white silk gown covered in expensive sparkling diamonds. They looked like the absolute perfect picture of young, wealthy, innocent love. But I knew exactly what was hiding right beneath that beautiful, shiny surface. They were two desperate, cornered predators, waiting anxiously for the final signature that would allow them to completely drain $20 million from Vivian and Richard Sterling. The priest raised his hands slowly and looked out over the massive crowd of wealthy guests. His voice echoed loudly and clearly through the pristine professional sound system. He took a deep breath and spoke the exact traditional words I had been patiently waiting for. He asked if there was anyone present here today who firmly believed these two people should not be legally joined in holy matrimony. Let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The entire massive ballroom was completely silent. It was a polite, respectful silence. Nobody in that wealthy elite crowd ever expected anyone to actually stand up and object at a high society wedding. Julian smiled confidently at his beautiful bride, completely believing he had finally won the ultimate prize. He thought his terrible dark past was securely locked away in a dirty rural farmhouse. He thought the old blue-collar mechanic was safely rotting away in a state-run medical asylum. I placed my rough, calloused hands firmly flat against the heavy brass handles of the massive oak doors. I took one final deep, rattling breath. I pushed the heavy wooden doors violently open with every single ounce of physical strength left in my aging body. The loud, heavy crash of the thick wooden doors hitting the stone walls echoed through the massive ballroom like a sudden, violent explosion. The beautiful string quartet stopped playing instantly, an absolute shocking mid-note. 300 wealthy elite guests gasped loudly in absolute pure surprise and turned their heads violently toward the back of the room. I stepped out of the dark shadows and walked directly into the bright golden light of the grand ballroom. I did not limp. I did not shuffle my feet. For the first time in over 20 long years, I completely ignored the agonizing sharp pain in my crushed left knee. I stood absolutely perfectly straight. I pulled my shoulders back and held my head high. I wore my cheap 10-year-old dark suit with the exact same fierce pride I used to wear my heavy grease-stained union coveralls. I held the thick manila folder completely packed with devastating federal evidence tightly in my right hand. I looked straight down the long, pristine white aisle directly at my only son. The confident, arrogant smile on Julian's face completely instantly vanished. All the warm color violently drained out of his perfectly tanned cheeks, leaving him looking like a sick, pale ghost. His eyes grew incredibly wide with absolute, pure, terrifying shock. He physically stumbled backward a few steps, almost tripping over the priest's heavy white robes. He looked at me exactly like he was staring at a terrifying monster that had just crawled straight out of the dark grave. Julian completely panicked. His slick corporate brain desperately tried to maintain the beautiful fake illusion he had built. He let go of Chloe's hands and rushed aggressively down the first few steps of the altar, pointing his shaking finger directly at me. His voice cracked loudly with raw, desperate terror as he screamed into the microphone. He yelled for the security guards to come immediately. He screamed that his father was having a severe aggressive dementia episode. He desperately begged the large men in dark suits to grab me and drag me out of the building before I could ruin the beautiful ceremony. He played the tragic, broken-hearted son perfectly, trying to convince the wealthy crowd that I was just a crazy, sick old man who had escaped from a medical ward. 2 massive private security guards immediately stepped out from the side doors and started walking aggressively toward me. I did not run. I did not raise my hands in defense. I just kept walking slowly and steadily down the long white aisle, staring completely dead into Julian's terrified, lying eyes. Suddenly, a massive, booming voice violently shattered the chaotic tension in the room. Richard Sterling stood up from his front row seat. He did not look like a polite, smiling, wealthy host anymore. He looked like a powerful, furious king who was ready to completely destroy a terrible enemy. He completely ignored his daughter's shocked, confused face. He pointed his heavy hand directly at the private security guards and ordered them to immediately step back. His deep voice echoed with absolute, undeniable authority. He told the entire room to let the man speak. The security guards instantly froze and backed away into the shadows. The entire ballroom was incredibly quiet. The only sound was the heavy, solid thud of my cheap leather boots walking proudly down the immaculate white runner. I walked past rows of wealthy, powerful people who were staring at me in absolute, complete confusion. I reached the very front of the beautiful altar. I stood exactly 3 feet away from my trembling, sweating son. He was breathing incredibly fast, looking around the room for any possible escape route, but there was absolutely nowhere left for him to hide. I did not scream. I did not yell. I kept my voice incredibly calm, incredibly cold, and absolutely terrifyingly clear. I handed the thick manila folder directly to the shocked priest, who was standing frozen behind the altar. I turned my body slightly so I could look directly at Julian, and also address the 300 elite guests sitting silently in the room. I told them my name was Raymond Gallagher. I told them I was a retired heavy machinery mechanic, and I was Julian's biological father. I stated clearly for the entire room to hear that my mind was completely perfectly sharp. I did not have dementia. I was not locked away in a medical facility. I told them the man standing at the altar had maliciously killed me off in his fake stories, simply because he was deeply ashamed of my rough, calloused hands and my cheap blue-collar clothes. Julian tried to interrupt me. He frantically whispered for me to please stop. He begged me quietly not to do this right now. But I completely ignored his pathetic, desperate pleading. I turned my attention directly to Richard and Vivian Sterling sitting in the front row. I spoke loudly so every single person in the massive room could hear the absolute, undeniable truth. I told the wealthy crowd exactly how Julian had violently funded his entire fake millionaire lifestyle. I explained step by step how he had secretly forged my signature on a highly illegal, fraudulent power of attorney. I told them how he used that forged document to steal a massive $750,000 commercial loan secured directly against my fully paid off 50-acre rural farm. I watched the faces of the elite corporate bankers and lawyers in the audience drop in absolute pure shock as they completely realized the massive scale of the financial crime. Julian was physically shaking now. Tears were welling up in his terrified eyes, but they were not tears of genuine regret. They were tears of absolute, pure, selfish defeat. Chloe was standing frozen next to him, her beautiful face contorted in absolute panic. She knew her entire dark secret was about to be violently exposed to the light. I did not stop there. I pointed my rough, heavy finger directly at Chloe's expensive, sparkling diamond engagement ring. I told the entire silent room that the beautiful, wealthy bride was completely drowning in massive, illegal underground sports betting debts. I told them she owed millions of dollars to violent, ruthless loan sharks out in Las Vegas. I explained clearly that they were absolutely not in love. I told the crowd that this beautiful, extravagant wedding was nothing more than a calculated, desperate corporate merger designed to forcefully trigger a strict release clause in the Sterling Family Trust Fund. I told them these two predators were planning to completely liquidate $20 million of Richard and Vivian's hard-earned money the absolute second they signed the official marriage certificate. The wealthy crowd erupted into loud, chaotic gasps of pure horror. People were whispering violently to each other. Vivian Sterling was quietly weeping into her silk handkerchief, while Richard sat perfectly still, staring at his lying daughter with absolute, pure, burning disgust. Chloe tried to scream that I was a crazy liar. She desperately grabbed Julian's arm and demanded he do something to stop me. But Julian was completely broken. He knew the heavy manila folder the priest was holding contained absolutely every single piece of undeniable printed proof. But I still had the absolute final killing blow. I looked directly over the crowd and locked eyes with Andre Sterling sitting quietly at the edge of the front row. Andre gave me a single firm nod. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small electronic remote control. He aimed it directly at the massive professional audio system stacked near the back of the room and pressed a single button. Suddenly, the crystal clear audio from my hidden security camera began to play directly through the massive speakers, echoing loudly over the entire shocked crowd. Every single person in the room heard Julian's arrogant, mocking voice perfectly clearly. They heard him casually laughing about how the dumb old man bought the fake dementia story. They heard him brutally plotting to forcefully foreclose on my house and throw me into a miserable, cheap state-run nursing home just to cover up his massive financial tracks. They heard him explicitly mention Chloe's terrible Vegas gambling problem. The absolute sheer evil of his recorded voice completely paralyzed the entire room. There was no spinning the truth. There was no clever corporate lawyer who could possibly explain away the pure, monstrous malice in his own spoken words. Julian collapsed onto his knees right there on the pristine white altar. He buried his face in his shaking hands and began to sob uncontrollably. The expensive, shiny mask was completely violently ripped off, exposing the pathetic, greedy criminal hiding underneath. I looked down at my broken, sobbing son. I did not feel a single ounce of fatherly pity. I only felt a deep, profound sense of absolute clean justice. I told him he was right about one thing. I told him I did not belong in his upper-crust wealthy world. But I told him he did not belong in it either. Right at that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the room opened again. This time it was not a grieving father walking through them. It was the absolute swift, crushing weight of the federal justice system. Andre Sterling stood up and buttoned his dark suit jacket. He calmly announced to the panicked room that he had personally contacted the federal authorities. He explained that by legally transferring my 50-acre farm into an irrevocable protective trust last night, Julian's forged bank loan had instantly become a massive federal wire fraud crossing state lines. Half a dozen armed agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across the back marched swiftly and aggressively down the long white aisle. They were closely followed by several uniformed local police officers. The massive ballroom instantly descended into absolute, total chaos. Wealthy guests were standing up, grabbing their expensive coats, and backing away from the altar in pure fear. The federal agents completely ignored the chaotic, screaming crowd. They marched straight up the carpeted steps and firmly grabbed Julian by his expensive velvet shoulders. They violently yanked him up off the floor and slammed his hands roughly behind his back. The loud, sharp clicking sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed brightly over the screaming crowd. At the exact same time, 2 local police officers grabbed Chloe's arms and placed her in handcuffs. She was screaming and crying violently, begging her father Richard to please save her. But Richard Sterling simply turned his back on her and held his crying wife tightly in his strong arms. He completely refused to look at the terrible monster his daughter had become. Julian was hyperventilating, sobbing heavily as the federal agents began to drag him back down the long white aisle. As they pulled him past me, he looked up into my rough, weathered face. His eyes were completely filled with pure, absolute terror and desperate regret. He begged me to please tell them to stop. He called me Dad and pleaded for me to save him, just like I had saved him so many times when he was a little boy. I stood absolutely perfectly still. I looked at the boy I had sacrificed my entire physical body to raise. I looked at the man who had stolen his dead mother's sacred charity money just to buy expensive champagne for strangers. I leaned in slightly and spoke in a voice so cold and quiet that only he could hear it. I told him that his father was not here anymore. I told him his father was locked away in a medical facility, completely losing his mind to dementia, just like he wanted. I told him he was completely entirely on his own. The federal agents dragged him out the heavy oak doors and out into the cold, dark reality of his completely ruined life. The massive ballroom was completely quiet again, leaving behind nothing but the shattered pieces of their massive criminal empire. I stood tall at the altar, feeling the absolute purest, most satisfying sense of righteous peace I had ever felt in my entire life. The terrible storm was finally completely over, and the innocent people were perfectly safe. The federal agents gripped my son's expensive velvet shoulders tightly, but Julian was no longer the arrogant, slick corporate consultant who had stood in my driveway just a few days ago. He was completely broken. As they dragged him past the front row, he suddenly threw his entire body weight forward and collapsed onto his knees right on the pristine white carpet. He looked up at me with his face completely soaked in tears. The shiny fake billionaire mask had completely melted away, leaving nothing but a terrified, pathetic coward. He begged me to listen to him. He swore that he never actually wanted to put me in a state-run medical facility. He sobbed uncontrollably, claiming that he was just desperate and that the massive bank loan was only supposed to be a temporary bridge. He swore he was planning to pay my property off the second he got his hands on the Sterling Family Trust Fund. He actually expected me to feel sorry for him. He wanted me to reach down, pat his expensive suit jacket, and forgive him for planning to leave me to die in a lonely room. Then he did the most predictable and disgusting thing a cornered predator can possibly do. He immediately turned on his own partner. Julian pointed his shaking finger at Chloe, who was actively struggling against the local police officers just a few feet away. He screamed that it was all her fault. He claimed she was the one with the massive illegal gambling debts, and that she had forced him to forge the documents to save her from the violent Las Vegas loan sharks. He threw the woman he was about to vow to protect for the rest of his life directly under the bus, hoping it would somehow buy his own freedom. Chloe heard every single cowardly word he said, and she completely lost her mind. The beautiful, flawless bride in the sparkling diamond gown suddenly transformed into a vicious, screaming animal. She fought against the metal handcuffs binding her wrists and screamed back at him at the absolute top of her lungs. Her voice echoed violently through the massive empty ballroom, completely destroying whatever tiny shred of dignity they had left. She called him a broke, pathetic loser who would still be living in a dirty rural farmhouse if it was not for her wealthy family connections. She yelled that he was the one who happily stole his dead mother's charity money to buy expensive clothes because he was so deeply insecure and ashamed of his own father. They tore each other apart right there on the floor of the multi-million-dollar estate. It was a spectacular, loud, and completely humiliating display of their absolute moral bankruptcy. The federal agents had absolutely no patience left for their toxic screaming match. The lead agent pulled Julian forcefully back to his feet. He looked my son dead in the eye and clearly recited the massive federal charges waiting for him. He told Julian he was being officially arrested for aggravated identity theft, massive federal bank fraud forgery, and criminal conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The local police officers read Chloe her rights right over her loud, desperate screaming. They formally charged her with criminal conspiracy and felony attempted grand larceny. She tried to twist her body to appeal to her father, but Richard Sterling had already walked completely out of the room, refusing to even witness her humiliating exit. They slapped another set of heavy steel handcuffs onto Julian's wrists, ensuring he could not try to fight or run. The loud metallic clicking sound was the absolute final period at the end of his fake, glamorous story. I stood perfectly still on the altar and watched the federal agents haul him away. He looked absolutely ridiculous, stumbling in his custom-tailored designer tuxedo with his hands bound tightly behind his back. Every single thing he had stolen from me to build his fake reputation was completely gone in one single devastating swoop. The federal government would immediately seize his leased luxury sports car, his expensive watches, and his fancy corporate bank accounts to pay back the massive forged loan. He was losing his wealthy upper-crust fiancée, his stolen assets, his fake social status, and his physical freedom, all at the exact same time. The heavy oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung wide open, and the bright afternoon sunlight poured into the stone hallway. The agents pushed Julian and Chloe out of the beautiful venue and directly into the back of the waiting, flashing police cruisers. The heavy car doors slammed shut completely, cutting off their desperate screaming and officially sealing their terrible fate. I remained standing at the front of the quiet ballroom, staring at the empty doorway for a very long time. A heavy, complicated mixture of emotions washed completely over my tired body. Deep down in the very bottom of my heart, there was a profound, heavy sorrow. I mourned for the sweet, innocent little boy who used to sit on my lap and help me fix old, broken lawnmowers in the garage. I felt a terrible, agonizing ache for the bright future Sarah and I had dreamed of when we brought him home from the hospital. That innocent boy was officially dead and buried. But rising high above that fatherly grief was an incredibly powerful, undeniable sense of absolute profound satisfaction. The dangerous, manipulative monster that Julian had willingly chosen to become was completely, permanently stopped. He would never be able to steal another dollar from an innocent, hard-working family. He would never be able to look down his nose at another honest mechanic and treat them like disposable garbage. I had sacrificed my youth, my health, and my entire physical body to raise him. But today I had finally used my rough, calloused hands to completely tear down his evil empire and protect the innocent people he tried to destroy. I reached up and gently touched the fragile white rose pinned securely to my dark wool lapel. I looked up at the high vaulted ceiling of the beautiful mansion and took a deep, steadying breath, knowing Sarah was incredibly proud. It has been exactly 6 months since the heavy oak doors of that massive estate slammed shut on my son's fake billionaire life. The swift, heavy hammer of the federal justice system did not show him a single ounce of mercy. He is currently sitting in a cold concrete federal holding facility waiting for his official sentencing hearing. His expensive defense attorneys completely abandoned him when his stolen funds were completely frozen. He is now facing a mandatory minimum of 10 hard years in a federal penitentiary for aggravated identity theft and massive bank fraud. Chloe took a desperate plea deal, completely turning state's evidence against the violent Las Vegas loan sharks who were hunting her, but she is still looking at least 5 years behind steel bars for her central role in the criminal conspiracy. I do not write him letters. I do not accept his desperate collect calls from the jailhouse phone. The innocent boy I loved and sacrificed my entire physical body to raise is completely gone. I made my peace with his death the moment I walked out of that grand ballroom. Back on my 50-acre property, the heavy silence is no longer suffocating or lonely. It is incredibly peaceful. The brilliant, irrevocable trust Andre Sterling set up in his dark office that night completely shielded my lifelong home from the aggressive commercial banks. Because the federal investigators conclusively proved the commercial loan was entirely based on highly illegal forged documents, the massive debt was completely wiped from my permanent legal record. My beautiful land is entirely safe and completely mine again. I sit on my weathered wooden front porch every single morning, drinking my bitter black coffee, and I look out over the green rolling fields where Sarah and I built our honest life together. The toxic dark cloud of my son's terrible betrayal has finally lifted from my heavy shoulders. It has been completely replaced by a profound, deep sense of clean, hard-earned peace. I survived the absolute worst betrayal a father can possibly endure, and I am still standing perfectly tall. But the absolute most beautiful, unexpected blessing to come out of this terrible dark nightmare is the profound lasting friendship I have built with the Sterling family. Two vastly different worlds collided in the most violent, devastating way possible, but instead of walking away in bitterness, we built an absolute, unbreakable bond. Every single Sunday afternoon, I drive my old dusty pickup truck down the long highway directly into the wealthy heart of Atlanta. I park my rusted truck right next to Richard's expensive luxury cars in his massive paved driveway, and I do not feel a single ounce of shame or embarrassment. Vivian always meets me right at the massive front door with a warm, genuine hug that makes me feel like true family. She is a remarkably strong, elegant woman who survived the terrible heartbreak of losing her daughter to absolute greed, but she refuses to let that darkness completely consume her beautiful spirit. We eat massive plates of perfectly roasted chicken and warm cornbread while we talk about everything from the changing seasons to the crazy state of the modern world. We laugh loudly and share our deepest life stories completely free from any hidden agendas. Richard and I spend hours sitting together on his expansive back patio drinking cold sweet iced tea and talking about the honest value of a hard day's work. We are two proud older men from completely different racial and social backgrounds. He built a massive, multi-million-dollar real estate empire, and I spent my entire life turning heavy steel wrenches in a freezing freight yard. But underneath the expensive clothes and the engine grease, we are exactly the same kind of man. We are dedicated builders. We are fierce protectors of our families. We are strongly united forever by our absolute unbreakable refusal to let greedy, entitled predators destroy the innocent people we love. We did not just survive the vicious attack on our families, we completely conquered it together. Andre is no longer just my brilliant corporate lawyer. He is a true, deeply trusted friend who regularly calls me just to check on my bad knee and make sure my old truck is still running smoothly. The federal authorities moved quickly and efficiently to completely recover the $50,000 Julian had maliciously stolen from Sarah's Sacred Memorial Fund. The wedding caterer was my old friend Thomas from the Union Freight Yard. The absolute second Thomas found out the massive catering deposit was funded entirely by stolen charity money, he gladly, legally returned every single penny directly to my bank account. But I did not just put the precious money back into a quiet, dormant savings account to gather dust. With Andre's brilliant corporate legal help, I completely restructured the funds and officially established the Sarah Gallagher Memorial Trade Scholarship. Every single year moving forward, we are going to provide full tuition payments for young, hardworking kids who want to learn how to be heavy mechanics, skilled welders, and master carpenters. We are giving a massive hand up to the tough, resilient kids who are absolutely not afraid to get their hands dirty to build a solid, honest life. I tell the young students exactly what it takes to survive in a brutal physical industry. I tell them about the deep pride that comes from looking at a completely rebuilt engine and knowing your own two hands brought it back to life. When I stood up on a brightly lit stage last month and proudly handed out the very first official scholarship check to a young man in heavy work boots, Richard, Vivienne, and Andre were sitting right there in the very front row clapping loudly for me. They cheered for my late wife's beautiful memory with absolute genuine love and respect. I looked out at their smiling faces, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had done the exact right thing. My beautiful wife's sacred legacy is finally completely safe. Her memory is no longer a cheap stolen pawn in a fake billionaire's twisted game. Her name is actively helping build strong, honest futures for good people. I lost my only biological son to extreme greed and terrible arrogance. But in the highly destructive ashes of his terrible criminal choices, I found an entirely new family. And I finally found the absolute strength to forgive myself for the boy I could not save. I want to take a moment right now to step back and speak directly to every single person listening to my voice today. I learned the hardest lesson a father can ever possibly learn, and it nearly cost me absolutely everything I had left in this world. I need you to listen to me very carefully, because this could save your own life. Blood does not give anyone the right to abuse you. Sharing a last name does not give someone a free pass to completely steal your peace, your dignity, or your hard-earned life savings. True family respects your profound sacrifices. They do not view your unconditional love as a stupid weakness to be violently exploited for their own selfish gain. Do not ever let anyone make you feel small or insignificant because your hands are dirty from honest work. If your knuckles are permanently swollen from arthritis and your clothes are stained with thick engine grease or dirt from the fields, you need to wear those heavy marks like a badge of absolute honor. You are the one who built the solid foundation they are proudly standing on today. Never let a person wearing a fancy suit make you feel ashamed of the calluses you earned paying for that suit. If you start seeing red flags in your own home, do not close your eyes. Do not ignore the strange phone calls, the missing paperwork, the sudden defensive attitudes, or the quiet whispers, simply because you desperately want to believe the absolute best in the people you love. Dig deeper. Trust your gut instincts immediately, because by the time you finally have the solid, undeniable proof in your hands, the catastrophic damage is usually already done. God gave me the ultimate strength to stand up in that massive, extravagant church and stop the terrifying monster I accidentally created. Do not wait as long as I did to demand the basic respect you entirely deserve. Action changes your future. If this family story deeply resonated with you today, if you have ever had to make the agonizing, heartbreaking decision to cut toxic family members completely out of your life, to fiercely protect your own peace, I need you to hit that like button right now. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell notifications so we can continue to build this strong, supportive community together. I want you to drop a comment below with your city and the exact time you are watching this video and tell me, honestly, did I do the right thing? Did I make the right choice by sending my only son away to federal prison? Thank you so much for staying with me until the very final word. Your time and your willingness to listen truly means absolutely everything. As an important reminder, the stories you hear on this channel may contain fictionalized elements created specifically for educational and storytelling purposes to help protect privacy while sharing meaningful life lessons. Until next time, keep your eyes wide open and your heart heavily guarded.